What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if neglected Naruto is secretly dying Chunin exams? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. Naruto howled with laughter and nearly tripped over his own feet as he sped through the central marketplace with two Chunin hot on his heels. A large guffaw drove the air from his lungs and left him choking for breath even as he jumped over a low-stalled table. Uzumaki! One of the Chunin roared, followed by a string of curses from the other that Amino-sensei would have kicked Naruto's ass for repeating out loud. The shinobi were echoed by the civilians around him who squawked and scattered like chickens in a pen. Dodging around a startled old woman, Naruto took a moment to twist around and blow a raspberry at the Chunin before bursting out laughing again at their enraged faces, which were liberally splattered with purple and orange paint. He could practically see the spittle flying from their mouths as they continued to rant and rave. Just as he turned back around, Naruto's foot caught the edge of a large basket of apples, sending both them and him sprawling across the street. He stifled his laughter and flipped back up onto his feet, then scrambled up the nearest drainpipe like the squirrel his teachers often compared him to. The Chunin ran straight up the wall after him without even pausing to adjust for their sudden horizontal positions. Naruto took a brief moment to bemoan his still in the academy status. He wanted to learn how to defy gravity like that, if only so that he could get his revenge on it for knocking him over so many times. More than once one of his flawless, perfectly planned pranks turned into a clusterfuck because the oh-so-mighty gravity decided that his wasn't balanced quite right in his hiding place. But of course jutsu like that were not available for academy students. Naruto's own issues with preforming jutsu were another story entirely, and one that he wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole at the moment. With one last burst of speed, Naruto dove through a narrow window just big enough for him, a scrawny, but still manly and strong, kid to squeeze through, but too small for the Chunin. He knew the Chunin would try to tear the building apart looking for him, and then get smacked around by the tiny old woman, who was actually a retired Anbu, who lived here and ran the store below. Naruto knew about her because he'd tried to get a kunai pouch from her once and almost got his hand chopped off for the trouble. She might have called it stealing, but her prices were too ridiculous for anyone under Chunin to even think about buying, let alone an orphaned academy student. And she didn't even believe him when he told her that he was only going to borrow it for a few weeks. As retaliation for her exorbitant, overpriced, stuck-up, "No, you may not have the shuriken either." Merchandise, Naruto happily used her bedroom window to escape from the Chunin, then snuck out the emergency escape hatch she'd built into the fireplace while they wasted time looking for him. By the time they realized he was gone, Naruto had already run halfway across the market district, snickering to himself as he wove through the crowds. He should probably lay low for a while, at least until those Chunin removed the sticks that had been shoved up their asses, making them incapable of understanding that paint did wash out, and getting so pissed off over a harmless prank would do more harm than taking the joke and laughing about it. Naruto would probably have to avoid his apartment until things had calmed down. For no apparent reason, every shinobi Chunin and above seemed to know where he lived. Naruto scoffed to himself, thinking that he should try to find a new apartment just to throw them off. Not that he was too worried about anyone getting into his apartment, it was lethally booby-trapped. He'd nearly killed himself a few times getting inside. He should probably remedy that. Shuriken hurt, whether they just cut off a finger or sliced through your jugular. Skirting along the outskirts of the business district, Naruto headed toward where the smaller shinobi training grounds were grouped together. The majority of them were outside the walls, fenced off, and required a shinobi ID to access. The lower-numbered training grounds, however, mostly consisted of open wooded clearings just inside the village. It was among these Naruto found himself able to hide away from the village when he needed to. Civilians didn't go near the training grounds, and Chunin usually used the more dangerous ones. Hell, even animals shied away because the ground was too saturated with chakra. Well, that and animals tended to avoid him anyway, but that was neither here nor there. Naruto stopped before a tall ash tree and quickly scrambled up into its branches. Sitting in the split in the trunk about 10 feet off the ground, he hummed as he pulled out and thumbed through the stack of small square papers he'd lifted from an art store while using his latest prank as a distraction. Naruto hadn't gotten quite as many as he had wanted, but they would have to do for the time being. There was no way in hell he'd actually dip into his meager savings to buy something like that. Leaning back against the tree, Naruto took out a small stone bowl and a kunai. He pressed the kunai into the skin of his arm and then sliced down deep enough that he nearly hit bone. It hurt like a bitch, but he had to cut that deep to get enough blood to drain into the bowl before the wound sealed up a few seconds later, muscle and flesh stitching itself back together with a quiet squelch. He swished the bowl around, continuing to hum thoughtfully as he made sure that he had enough blood. Ink was, technically, a much better medium to use for creating seals, but it was also a whole lot more expensive. And while ink conducted chakra much better in general, using his own blood made sure that no one other than him could use the seals he made, which he found to be an added bonus. Naruto yanked at the brush that hung from a cord on his shoulder, pulling it free from its clip. He kept the brush there partially for easy access, but mainly just because he used to keep it with his kunai and stabbed himself one too many times while digging around for it in his pockets. He dipped the brush in the bowl, held it up until all the excess blood had dripped off, and then swiftly drew it across one of the paper tags with short, smooth motions. The boy bit his tongue as he worked, being carefully to keep his strokes as small as possible. Seals were annoying to make, to be frank. They took too much patience and time for an effect that would only last a few seconds. He guessed that seals which were more complex than the explosion tags he was making would probably be worth it, but he would have to learn that kind of a skill from a seal master, not just copying seals like he'd learned to do. And there were only a handful of seal masters in the world. Naruto couldn't afford to buy explosion tags, so he made his own. He would do the same with kunai and shuriken if he could, but he knew nothing of blacksmithing other than that the craft mostly used forges or fire jutsu, both which he knew nothing about. In any case, copying seals was pretty easy so long as he carefully made the exact strokes. And not jerk his hand a little too much and connect two lines that really weren't supposed to be connected like he just did. Making mistakes with seals was very bad, capitalization required. Ah shush. The mostly completed tag exploded in Naruto's face. A shockwave of compressed air and chakra blasted outward and hit him and the tree he was propped up in at point-blank range. He heard a loud crack and slammed into something, and then the world around him abruptly went black, like pulling the plug on a television. Naruto blinked slowly as the world began to refocus. He felt tingly and numb, with an added dash of disorientation. His first thought was that blood-based seals were much more volatile than ink-based ones. His second was that a man stood over him, panicking. That's new, Naruto mused aloud. Or tried to. It came out as a wet gurgle, followed by one of his lungs attempting to cough its way out of his chest. Naruto didn't think he'd ever seen someone look worried for his sake before. Or at least he thought the man was worried. He wore a mask that covered most of his face so Naruto couldn't exactly read his expression. Maybe the man was actually laughing at him and Naruto just couldn't tell over the ringing in his ears. Don't move, the man said tersely. His hands pressed against Naruto's chest and blood leaked from between his fingers. Naruto blinked again to clear his eyesight and found that he was laid out on the ground a few feet from the tree he'd been in, or rather, what had once been a tree. It had pretty much been torn apart by the explosion and now resembled a demented artist's impression of a tree. Naruto laughed weakly when he realized that insinuated that he was a demented artist. Not too far from the truth, he thought. Looking down, Naruto saw a large chunk of a branch about the width of his arm sticking out of his midsection, just below his ribcage. He couldn't feel anything at all below that point, so he assumed the wood had severed his spine. The upper half of his body prickled with white-hot bursts of pain, as though he was on fire. He'd give it a 6 on his personal Naruto pain scale. It was just above the torn stomach episode, and a little below the near decapitation incident. Perhaps he was a little too reckless. He'd had enough brushes with death that it was starting to resemble stalking rather than accidental encounters. A twinge zapped through Naruto and he groaned aloud, feeling his skin and muscles tighten around the branch as his body attempted to heal despite the foreign object's new home in his stomach. He really needed to pull it out of his body or it would start to incorporate the wood as it healed and he'd wind up picking wood splinters out of his skin for a week. This was, however, the first time Naruto ever gotten badly injured in front of a witness. There was no way he could hide his regeneration now, not with what was clearly a fatal wound. Although, the man standing over him did have just one eye, so maybe Naruto could pass it off as the man being blind. The forehead protector covering his other eye told Naruto otherwise though, because no one would believe him over a shinobi. Well, unless he claimed harassment or something, but that probably wouldn't work. The man had gray hair, so maybe he was old, Naruto noted as his vision began to swim from the rapid blood loss. That would probably make him a respectable shinobi. Which meant something. Naruto's thoughts were slipping through his fingers and flying around in his head too fast for him to catch. Just pull it out, Naruto groaned. He wasn't coughing up blood, so the branch had missed his lungs, which was a good sign at least. Not being able to breathe got annoying pretty quickly, plus it makes him dizzy for half an hour afterward. Oh right, respectable. If this shinobi was respectable, then everyone would believe him if he leaked info about Naruto's healing ability. Naruto could always start a smear campaign against him, like he'd done with that nasty cabbage salesman with the crooked teeth. That might take a bit too long though. You'll bleed to death, the man said. It needs to stay in to staunch the bleeding until I can get a medic nin out here. He was keeping remarkably calm for someone watching a kid die before him. Maybe he was one of those shinobi who hated Naruto. No, he would have just walked away and let the boy die if that were the case. The only other option Naruto could think of was that the man had been on enough assassination missions to be comfortable around large amounts of blood. It wasn't a particularly pleasant thought. Repressing a sigh as his vision started to blacken, Naruto realized that he didn't have much of a choice if he wanted to keep his regeneration as much of a secret as possible. He'd deal with the repercussions later, before he passed out and woke up in the hospital with dozens of stunned medic nin around him. I heal, Naruto said between short breaths as it became harder to force his lips to move and his voice to come out. Move, the damn branch. Naruto's vision blurred too much to see the shinobi's reaction, but a moment later a pair of hands closed around the wood and pulled it out with a sharp tug. Naruto gasped as a spike of white-hot pain shot through him, momentarily darkening his vision again and making a series of shudders rack his entire body. But like all pain, it passed as quickly as it had come, and he could already feel his muscles knitting back together, erasing any proof that the fatal injury had been there in the first place. The boy lay panting on the ground for a long minute before he even attempted to move. He rolled over on his hands and knees, pushed himself up, and staggered to his feet. For a moment he considered running, but that would hardly solve his problem, and he had little doubt that the shinobi could catch him. He rolled his shoulders and cracked his neck, then turned to face his rescuer. The shinobi stood a few feet away with his hands held loosely at his sides and his single visible eye narrowed. Naruto grimaced when he saw the man's Jonin vest smeared with his blood. "You're alive," the man said pointedly. Naruto raised an eyebrow. "No, I'm a fucking ghost and you're really just hallucinating this whole thing." The shinobi stared at him. Naruto sighed. Older shinobi never had a sense of humor. Granted, that was half of what made pranks so much fun, getting some kind of reaction out of them. Amino-sensei, for example, sometimes turned a lovely shade of purple. Alas, Naruto was firmly lodged between a rock and hard place with no visible escape route. Instead of continuing his staring contest with the shinobi, he pivoted on his heel and looked back up at the impressionist-styled tree. From the look of it, all the paper he'd just gotten had been burned up in the blast. Pity. Naruto began to pick up the rest of his equipment that had been scattered and clicked his tongue against his teeth when he saw the stone bowl he'd been using for years lying in the grass nearby, split into 3 pieces. Running his finger down one of the surprisingly smooth edges, he wondered whether it would be cheaper to fix it or just get a new one. The shinobi coughed. Naruto glanced back at him with the bowl pieces still in his hand and raised an eyebrow again. The man sent a meaningful look at the gaping hole in Naruto's black t-shirt that showed nothing but smooth, if blood-smeared, skin underneath. "How exactly are you standing?" the man asked. "Marionette strings," Naruto replied instantly. The man gave him that stare again. Fine, I heal. As in, from anything from a scratch to being stabbed through the heart by my goddamned fairy godmother. And no, I'm not a zombie. I guess technically I could be classified as one. Zombie Naruto. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? The man tilted his head to the side and considered Naruto suspiciously. "Let me guess. I need to see the Hokage," Naruto said before he could speak up. Abruptly the shinobi leaned back and smiled through his mask, completely shifting his body language. Exactly, he said cheerfully. Before Naruto had the chance to do much more than blink at the sudden shift in persona, the man approached him. Naruto tensed, ready to flee. The man continued to smile. Not that smiling was a sure sign of friendliness. Clowns also smiled, and everyone was well aware that they were just waiting to jump you once your back was turned. Should we go then? Naruto prompted. The shinobi nodded and grasped the blonde's shoulder. Alarmed, Naruto tried to jerk away but the man's grip held like steel. All of a sudden Naruto felt a pulse of chakra and flinched away, and then abruptly the world shifted around him in a dizzying display of colors and shapes before reforming to show a large office around them. A few feet away in front of a large window was a great oak desk, and behind it sat the third Hokage. It didn't take a genius to guess that the man had transported them using the Shunshin Jutsu. Naruto had seen shinobi use it before and been struck by its usefulness, but now more than ever he really wished he could use it. The very thought of the pranks he could get up to with a quick escape route at his fingertips sent a delightful shiver down his spine. "Might I ask what you are doing, Hitaki?" the Hokage asked the tall shinobi beside him. Naruto frowned up at him, suddenly realizing he barely even came up to the shinobi's waist. "Damn tall adults. Here to report an incident, Hokage-sama." Naruto looked back to the Hokage and shifted uncomfortably. The sun shining in from the windows behind the old man made it difficult to see his expression, an effect the Hokage probably 100% intended. The shinobi opened his mouth to explain, but Naruto abruptly cut him off with a curt, "I can regenerate." Both of the older men stared at him, so Naruto shrugged. He knew he wasn't going to get out of this predicament, not without fighting against the Hokage, which pretty much equaled instant capture, and that was not a situation he was willing to go through. So it was better to make sure that there would be no confusion that could lead to an ugly misunderstanding. Plus Naruto hoped to get a few brownie points by coming forward himself instead of having the truth dragged out of him. "I can't die, sir," Naruto continued blithely while staring straight ahead. "No matter what happens to me I regenerate almost instantly. I've survived a number of accidents that should have killed me." There wasn't a single muscle in the Hokage's face that so much as twitched, but there was still a noticeable change in the atmosphere of the office. "Accidents?" the Hokage said. Naruto rubbed the back of his neck. Well, I was kind of clumsy when I was younger and got hurt a lot, but never actually stayed hurt. I didn't really realize it was unusual for a long while, not until..." He cut himself off, swallowing nervously. The Hokage didn't say anything and didn't prompt for him to continue, but Naruto felt the pressure anyway. He glanced between the Hokage and Hitaki. Both of them looked completely impassive and gave nothing at all away. Naruto started sweating a bit more. "Well, okay, this is going to sound kind of bad, but it's really not. I mean, Naruto swallowed again. "Okay, look, I was like 5 years old and I snuck into some shinobi's house while he was on a long-term mission. Only, his house was trapped and I wound up getting locked in a cellar for a couple weeks without any food or water. I got out when he came back and reset everything, but, well, I starved for a long while there. It wasn't exactly fun, but obviously I survived. I think there were a couple other times where I should have gotten killed. I've stabbed myself with kunai a few too many times." "Show me," the Hokage said. Shrugging, Naruto pulled out a kunai and drew a shallow slice across his palm. He held his hand up so that the Hokage could watch as the cut quickly faded away before any blood could even drip out. The third stared at Naruto for a long minute. His wrinkled old thumb ran up and down the length of his pipe, though he didn't move it anywhere near his lips. His gaze was unreadable and Hitaki stayed silent beside Naruto. "This bears some thought," the Hokage said at last. "Why did you not come forward with this earlier?" Naruto blinked owlishly at him. "And say what, exactly?" he asked with a snort. "That I'm a freak who can't be killed. Sure, it's a useful skill, but I'm not part of a clan or anything and I have no idea what caused it." He stopped abruptly and squinted at the Hokage. "You're not as surprised as you should be. Even with the whole stone face thing." The Hokage leaned back and let a small smile cross his face. "You are nearly a genin, correct?" he questioned instead of answering. "Yes, sir. I have half a year left at the academy." Sir?" Naruto inquired when the Hokage continued to stay silent for several minutes. The old man blinked, as though he had forgotten they were still in the room. Then he sighed heavily. I am pulling you out of the academy. Naruto physically reeled back as a jolt of shock ran through him. Being a shinobi was the only thing he'd ever really wanted for himself. It was everything he had been working toward for as long as he could remember. What? That's not fair. Naruto protested vehemently, balling his hands into fists. And graduating you early. All Naruto could think to say was, oh. The tight ball of fury that had built in his chest dissipated, and was quickly replaced with a burning curiosity. Are you sure that's wise, Hokage-sama? The tall shinobi next to Naruto asked. We have the academy for a reason. He's not ready for active shinobi duty yet. Naruto wanted to protest that he was more than ready, but doing so would be more of a lie than the time he'd tried to claim he was a reincarnation of the Shoden Hokage. He was fast and strong, but he still couldn't perform even the simplest jutsu. Naruto had failed the last 2 tests in the academy for that reason, which frustrated him to no end. He knew the theory like the back of his hand, but manipulating his chakra was like pulling teeth from an angry hyuga. These are special circumstances, the Hokage said. He took a puff from his pipe and leaned back further in his chair, looking thoughtful. It would be preferable to keep your abilities under wraps, Naruto-kun. There are some who would not take well to it. Not take, what? Naruto repeated while frowning. Because I have a weird ability but I'm not in a clan, you mean? The Hokage heaved a sigh. He set his pipe down and folded his hands together on top of his desk. His fingers were surprisingly straight and smooth, and the only part of them that gave away his age were the sunspots on the backs of his hands. Without the spots, Naruto would have guessed them to belong to a man half the third's age. The Hokage's face, on the other hand, had long grooves in his skin, like valleys on a mountainside. His face looked old. His eyes were like his hands, young and clear. Naruto felt like those eyes could see straight through him. Naruto-kun, now that you are officially a shinobi, there is a first lesson you must learn. History is what we make of it, the Hokage said. The shinobi world is that of subterfuge and deception. The darkness is our ally and lies are our sustenance. Your job as a shinobi is to see underneath the underneath, to see past the tricks and lies, and to understand our world as it truly is. Do you understand? Why, yes, sir. Then you do not, the Hokage said, his words snapping through the air like a whip and causing Naruto to jump in surprise. You will never be able to see the world as it is. Nor will I, nor will any man. Our entire reality is made of lies built upon lies. We fold them over each other as a blacksmith folds metal until they are so strong that they are reality. You will have look underneath the underneath, yes, but you must also understand that reality is what each man makes of it, and it differs for every person who lives and breathes on this earth. History in particular is subjective. You are aware of the story of the Nine Tails' defeat, of course? Naruto swallowed thickly. Of course, sir. I was born on the day it was killed. Yes, you were. Or rather, were not, I should say. Sir? Naruto's brow furrowed. The Nine Tails is one of the tailed beasts who have walked the earth since the days of the Sage of the Six Paths. It is an energy construct, a being made of pure, chaotic chakra. It is not truly alive, not as we are, and it cannot be killed any more than a man can kill a landslide. The fourth Hokage did not kill the Nine Tails. Instead, he did what has been done to all other tailed beasts before it. He sealed it away, into the only container that can hold that much chakra without breaking. A newborn baby. The dread that had been coiling in the pit of Naruto's stomach while the Hokage spoke dropped like a stone and hit him like a sucker punch. Naruto could physically feel the blood drain from his face. He knew he was different. That was a bit difficult to miss. He knew about the black seal on his stomach too. But he never could have imagined. The Hokage smiled kindly. You are a Jinchuriki, Naruto-kun. A container for a demon. It is a great burden, one which I feel will trouble you for as long as you live, but your service has saved Hidden Leaf Village. Naruto shook his head. He couldn't form a complete coherent thought in his own head, never mind say one out loud. I cannot tell you where exactly your advanced regenerative ability has come from, the Hokage continued. He sat back in his seat and sighed. The seal on your abdomen was the fourth's own creation. Before him no one had ever attempted to use the death god as a sealing medium. It was a powerful technique that locked the Nine Tails away into you, and only the death god itself could tell you what effects its presence had on the seal. I'm just a prison, Naruto whispered, voice scratchy. Not a person, just a prison. Prisons have to be whole to hold their prisoners. The Hokage frowned fiercely. You are a hero, Naruto-kun, he said with steel in his voice. Do not ever allow yourself to think differently. You are all that stands between our village and the Nine Tails. Always remember that. He picked up his pipe again, but instead of lighting it he put it away in one of the drawers of his desk. But I think that is enough for today. You have much to think about and you will be quite busy starting tomorrow, so I will let you head on home. Be aware that the knowledge of the Nine Tails' true fate is an A-ranked secret. Though most adults in this village know of it, they are forbidden under pain of death from speaking about it. Your regeneration will be kept as an A-ranked secret for now as well. I am sad to say that there are some who would not take well to it, and others who would try to take advantage of it. You have done well so far keeping it under wraps, so I expect you will be able to continue to do so. If anyone starts to question you, however, please report directly to my office. That's an order, it will go above the order of any of your superiors. You are dismissed, Naruto-kun. Report to the Records and Archives Department tomorrow morning for your official registration. Naruto's head was spinning like an Inuzuka's Gatenga, but he managed to retain enough presence of mind to bow. I understand, Hokage-sama, he said. Hitaki escorted him from the room, but Naruto didn't even notice. 7 a.m., the 11th of September 311 Tay. Hidden Leaf Village, Eastern Forest. When Naruto woke up the morning after his ascent into Shinobi Hood, he nearly headed to the academy anyway. It took some effort to remember he no longer had to attend school, and that realization felt odd. It was a weird thing to fixate on after the world-shattering revelations of the previous day, but perhaps preciously because of that his mind latched onto it like a starving man at a buffet. It wasn't that he would miss the academy, but it had been a part of his life for so long that the thought of going without it felt bizarre. Naruto had slept in the hills behind the academy that night, so he was already in view of the building by the time he realized he should have been heading in the opposite direction. It was far from the first time Naruto had slept outside, and he would probably do so for the next couple of days too, until he was sure those Chunin weren't actively trying to find him. He liked sleeping outside anyway. As Naruto crouched in a tree just in view of the academy and considered whether it was worth risking another trip through the market district to get to the Hokage Tower on time, he saw a few students from his class walk into the building. They would have to stay in the academy for the next 6 months while he was already a shinobi. Half of Naruto wanted to swell with pride, shove his finger under their noses, and tell that he was Uzumaki fucking Naruto, and that every single time they told him that he wasn't fit to be a shinobi was wrong and there was nothing that anyone could do to stop him now. The other half of Naruto, a very small part that he rejected faster than a prostitute with syphilis, felt like he'd cheated to get where he was. But if that was true, then his entire existence, 9 tails and all, was a cheat. And besides, the Hokage's words still echoed in his ears, shinobi lie. Ultimately Naruto decided to take the risk and ran to the Hokage Tower in record time. He hid whenever he saw another shinobi nearby, thankful not for the first time that he had long since catalogued all the easy-to-hide-in locations in Leaf Village. When he reached the tower he raced up the stairs to the 3rd floor while jealously wishing again that he could walk up walls like most shinobi, a thought that turned him suddenly giddy when he realized now he could learn the technique. The 3rd floor of the Hokage Tower was dedicated to record keeping. It was rumored to contain entire vaults full of files and old scrolls, along with the registration center. Unfortunately for Naruto, there was a disgruntled shinobi guard stationed at the floor's stair landing. "Whoa, kid," the man said when Naruto started to walk past him. His hand shot out to block the doorway. "This is a restricted floor. Shinobi access only." Naruto rolled his eyes. "I'm heading to registration, genius. Now if you wouldn't mind." The man snorted. "Let me give you a tip, brat. If you want to be a shinobi, you need to learn to tell lies that are actually believable. The next Genin graduation exam isn't for 6 months. As utterly brilliant advice as that is, because I'm so obviously new to telling lies, I'm a unique case and I have an appointment with the Hokage to get to. Just because you weren't told that I would be coming doesn't mean you shouldn't at least check with your superiors who, in this case, are waiting in the registration room just beyond that door." Naruto finished with a flourish, pointing into the room past the entrance. The shinobi scowled and drew himself up to his full height. He opened his mouth to angrily reply with what would have undoubtedly been a well-thought-out, witty retort when the silver-haired shinobi who found Naruto yesterday appeared suddenly and clapped the boy on the shoulder. "There you are, Naruto-kun. I was wondering where you'd gone off to," Hitaki said casually. Whatever the other shinobi had been about to say died on his lips faster than a pig at an Akamichi barbecue. The unreasonably tall shinobi steered Naruto past the now speechless man and toward the registration center. Naruto couldn't resist the urge to turn his head back and stick his tongue out. The man spluttered and the color rushed back into his cheeks, and Naruto snickered in response. Hitaki lightly cuffed him upside the head. "Oi!" Naruto protested, rubbing the offended area. Hitaki ignored him. The registration itself didn't take more than 10 minutes and was comprised of boring paperwork that Naruto would have gladly set on fire and launch at his academy instructors instead of filling out. When that was done, he had his picture taken and was issued a shiny shinobi ID card with the number 012572 printed across the bottom. He grinned gleefully while staring down at the proof that he had taken such a large step forward. Naruto turned to the gray-haired shinobi who had been shadowing him like a towering stalker the entire time and asked, "So did the Hokage send you to watch over me or something?" "Or something," Hitaki agreed with a closed-eye smile. "I will be your sensei from today onward." What about my genin team? You're an odd one out right now, so you won't have one. It'll be just you and me," he said. Naruto crossed his arms over his chest and stuck out his chin. "You haven't even told me your name yet or who you are. And for that matter, how did you come across me yesterday?" The man shrugged and started to lead him out of the tower. Naruto hesitated for a moment before following. "Hitaki Kakashi, Jonin of Hidden Leaf Village," he said. "As for your last question, that's a secret. Please don't tell me you're going for the mysterious old man effect," Naruto scoffed. He couldn't quite believe the man had just come across him by coincidence. Even he wasn't that unlucky. Hitaki hummed thoughtfully. "Well, I may be the master of all things mysterious, but I'm not old." "You've got gray hair," Naruto pointed out. "Underneath that mask you must be a wrinkly old man. Think what you like," Hitaki replied with a cheery tone. That was the first time Naruto had gotten a reaction like that. Generally people just got angry at him. "You're an old man," he declared again whilst watching Hitaki from the corner of his eye. "And I bet you've got some kind of horrible lip deformity and that's why you wear that mask. It's slowly spreading across your face and has even made it up to your left eye. You try to pretend it's all right, but really you cry yourself to sleep at night while wishing for a princess to come along and accept you for who you really are, deformity and all." Hitaki shot him an odd look. "It looks like I really will need to keep you in line," he said, amusement clear in his voice. They finally reached the street and still Hitaki walked on without explaining where they were headed. "To stop me from running around, transforming into a demon, and destroying half the known world?" Naruto asked while absently wondering if he could just slip away. There were a couple of pranks he wanted to get done by the end of the week. "If you get in trouble, it will fall on my head now." Naruto grinned brightly at that. "I'll have to keep that in mind. Which means no more pranks," Hitaki continued on blithely as though Naruto hadn't spoken. "Every time you get in trouble I'll tack on a night training session. Which means no sleep, no food." He sounded far too happy with the idea of such training. Naruto scoffed under his breath and intertwined his fingers behind his head, relaxing as he walked. Internally, he was more pleased than he probably should have been. He had a teacher, someone who was actually willing to train him, for the first time in his life. Naruto wasn't like the other kids in his class, who had their parents to teach them, and he'd always been more of a hands-on learner rather than being book smart, so the academy hadn't been an ideal learning environment for him. All his life he'd been fighting to prove to everyone around him that he had what it took to be a shinobi, and now he was one. Internally, Naruto was happier than a Yakuza boss on crack. As the buildings began to thin out around them, Hitaki continued his slow, lazy pace. "Can't you just shunshun us there?" Naruto grumbled. "Or at least, run. Patience is a virtue," Hitaki retorted. "Oh, of course, I forgot that being a shinobi is such a virtuous profession. Let me go get my poetry books and dancing fans so that I'll be all set." Hitaki grinned beneath his mask. "Don't forget your kimono, Miss Naruto. I'm sure all the boys will be complimenting how it goes with your eyes by the end of the day. And I'm sure all the old grannies are converging around your house. just waiting to get their hands on you. You must be quite popular, being the elder master of mysteries, Naruto shot back. Hitaki looked distinctly green at the thought. They entered a simple forested training ground not too far from where they had first met the day before. Flipping around his attitude again, Hitaki beamed down at Naruto, who suddenly had a very bad feeling, akin to the last time he'd tried to paint lewd symbols on the side of the Hyuga complex only to wind up twitching on the ground and thrown out with the trash. First, let's start off with introductions, Hitaki said. Likes, dislikes, hobbies, dream, etc. Naruto nodded slowly. Alright, I like messing with people and seeing their reactions. I dislike assholes and people who can't take a joke. My hobbies are training and pranking, and my dream. He frowned and let his eyes flick over the clearing. I want to become stronger than the Nine Tails. Hitaki quirked an eyebrow and said, that's an interesting goal. Naruto set his feet shoulder-width apart, crossed his arms over his chest, and scowled up at him. For as long as I can remember, people have always looked at me differently from everyone else. Now that I know about the Nine Tails, I understand why. But I didn't choose to be the Nine Tails Jinchuriki. I don't want to be just some cage. I want people to look at me and see Uzumaki Naruto, a goddamn awesome shinobi. So I'll become stronger than the Nine Tails and make them see me. For a long minute Hitaki stared at him with an unreadable gaze. He shook his head and then made an odd gesture with one hand. Well, it's a lofty goal, that's for sure, he said. Let's see how well you can do though. How about a simple test of ability? Then he vanished and Naruto stood gaping at the grass, and then a high kick slammed into the side of his head and sent him flying through the air. Naruto collided hard with the ground and rolled into a crouch, hissing in pain and clutching at his arm where some skin had been scraped off. Damn, the man hit hard. Naruto barely had the time to blink before Hitaki appeared in front of him again, and then he ducked and dodged and barely managed to avoid getting hit as the Jonin drove him backward. With a gasp, Naruto rolled under another punch and tried to strike back, but Hitaki was gone and then behind him, and Naruto had to lunge forward or get his skull cracked open by a speeding fist. Desperate for even just a moment to gather his wits, Naruto quickly took out a kunai that already had an explosion tag wrapped around its handle and flung it into the ground between them. Hitaki replaced himself with a log and Naruto turned tail and preformed a tactical retreat, otherwise known as running like hell for tree cover. He slid behind a couple of bushes, panting for breath as the few injuries he had managed to garner, in just a few seconds of fighting, healed and disappeared without a trace. Hitaki was nowhere to be seen. That scared the crap out of Naruto more than when the man was in his face. Naruto tensed up and scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. Every leaf blowing in the wind made his gaze snap toward it, every animal scampering through the underbrush. He froze. There were no animals in the training grounds. The earth was too soaked with chakra, so all but shinobi animals and a few birds steered clear of the area. Naruto dove from the cover of the bushes just as a squirrel jumped from the tree above him. As Naruto twisted in the air so that his gaze could follow it, his perception shifted and suddenly it was Hitaki barreling toward him. It wasn't that the Jonin transformed from a squirrel into human form, but rather like he had been looking at that optical illusion they showed everyone in the academy, where you were looking at the picture of a young woman and suddenly realized her chin was a nose and her necklace was a mouth. And then you realized you were looking at the picture of an old woman in the same picture and it was a henge, Naruto realized abruptly as his mind refocused on the problem at hand. A genjutsu he had seen 1,000 times before, but never seen used in battle. Suddenly it seemed a whole lot more useful. Naruto twisted around to land on his hands and preformed a handspring to avoid Hitaki's sweeping kick. He flipped back and blocked the next punch, which sent a shock running up his arm and through his shoulder. Naruto gritted his teeth and grabbed Hitaki's arm, intending to pull him into arm's reach so that he could actually fucking hit the man. But instead Hitaki tossed him over his shoulder, slamming Naruto into the ground and then followed up by smashing his foot into Naruto's chest. Naruto gasped in shock as several of his ribs audibly cracked and white spots danced before his eyes as a wave of sharp, hot pain washed over him. Thanks to your healing, I don't have to hold back with you, Hitaki said cheerfully as he stood over the boy. The training may be harsher, but you'll learn more quickly than most people. Naruto spluttered out a curse directed at Hitaki's mother as he lay on the ground wheezing. He could feel his ribs healing already, but it still hurt like hell. Damn. Evening. Knowing that Hitaki was good, Naruto didn't expect that he'd be so monstrously fast and strong. And Hitaki wasn't even going full out, thank God. Naruto couldn't begin to imagine how quickly he would have gotten killed had the Jonin been serious or even just used anything above academy-level jutsu. Now that's not very nice, Hitaki chided. He reached into one of his pockets and Naruto tensed, but his hand came out with nothing more than a slim orange book. He promptly buried his nose into and started to giggle quietly. Naruto eyed him warily, but Hitaki didn't seem inclined to attack again. So are you going to teach me anything now? Naruto asked as he slowly sat up. He could already feel the aches fading and his energy returning. Or just beat me into the ground some more? Hitaki smiled over the top of the book. I won't teach you anything until you've mastered your academy skills, he said. And I dare say that your ninjutsu is terrible at best. You didn't even try to use any. Grumbling, Naruto jumped to his feet and picked up the tattered, grass-stained remains of his jacket. He eyed the now barely recognizable orange material for a second and then deemed it irreparable, and Hitaki hadn't even used any weapons. Great, that was 2 outfits in as many days. More money down the drain. And Naruto didn't dare try to shoplift from one of the shinobi clothing stores again. Word had gotten around and he was pretty much a banned customer now in the main shopping district. It ain't my fault that they don't work, Naruto said. I know exactly how to do the jutsu. I should be able to do them perfectly. But when I perform a jutsu it just, sorta twists out of my control. Can you explain what your chakra does when you try? Naruto looked up at Hitaki in surprise. The man was still reading, but his tone sounded more serious than it had all day. Well, it's like water, Naruto said, faltering as he grasped around for the right words. Like I'm trying to pour water through my hands, except the faucet is on as high as it can go and the water is too strong for me to do anything about. He gestured vaguely with his hands. So even while I'm trying to direct it, it just goes in all different directions and just goes. He trailed off and scratched the back of his head. Show me the leaf exercise. What? Naruto blinked in surprise. Hitaki lowered the book and raised his eyebrow. The leaf chakra exercise. It's one of the first things you learn in the academy. Naruto rolled his eyes. Yes, I know what it is, he said dryly. But why? And the book went back up. Listen to your sensei, Naruto-chan. Sighing, Naruto picked up the nearest leaf. Why did he have to get stuck with a sensei who was completely insufferable? Yeah, whatever you say old man, he said. He untied his forehead protector. He was still giddy at the very thought of having one, and placed the leaf on his forehead. As always, it took a try or two to get the leaf to stick without blasting off his forehead, but eventually he managed it. Naruto jumped when Hitaki snapped his book close and put it away. He straightened up unconsciously, eagerly wondering what Hitaki would teach him. Practice your taijutsu kata until 1500. I'll see you here at 0600 tomorrow, Hitaki said. Then he grinned gleefully. And I'll know if you skip out on your kata, Naruto-chan. And then in a swirl of leaves, he left. Naruto stared at the spot Hitaki had stood in and wondered if had been stuck with a sensei, or just a stalker who taunted children for fun. Hitaki arrived at the training ground 2 hours late the next morning. Oh sure, now you show up, Naruto groused. What, did your makeup take too long to put on this morning? He had spent the previous day repeating the same boring kata over and over, and then started to do the same that morning while waiting. It didn't help that he had been jumpy the entire time, half expecting to get ambushed by his new teacher. A black cat crossed my path so I had to circle around the village to avoid it, Hitaki said with a grin. Was he a pathological liar too? And did the cat make you unable to use Shunshin? Naruto asked pointedly. It was a magical cat, Hitaki replied without missing a beat. It also gave me these. He held up his hand to show that he was holding what looked like a pair of silver bracelets. Naruto raised an eyebrow. For your old granny harem, I presume. Was it just him or was there a slight twitch in Hitaki's eye? Now Naruto-chan, play nice, he chided. These are chakra repressors. They're generally used by the interrogation and detention department. Hitaki-sensei. Naruto released a mock horrified gasp. How could you expose your student to something so kinky? You're supposed to be teaching me, not corrupting me. Yes, there was definitely a twitch there. Hitaki looked kind of like that one smiley samurai on that show that only aired in the middle of the night. It had horrible acting and special effects, and more gore than a B-rated movie, but somehow Naruto couldn't stop watching it. Ultimately Hitaki just smiled again, though it seemed to be more of a, "just wait, I will skin you while you sleep," smile than a happy smile. "Come now, don't be difficult," he said. In an instant Hitaki crossed the distance between them and slapped one of the bands shut around Naruto's wrist. The boy's eyes widened in shock at the feel of cold metal closing around him, squeezing a portion of his chakra back. He ripped his wrist from Hitaki's hands and swung his other fist at him, just barely missing his nose as Hitaki leaned back. With a feral snarl Naruto scrambled backward. He tugged at the manacle frantically and his eyes darted around, looking for the quickest escape route. "Naruto!" He turned to take off into the forest but suddenly Hitaki was there, pinning his arms behind his back. Naruto struggled against Hitaki with every ounce of strength he had. As he twisted he bit Hitaki's arm, sinking his teeth deep into the man's skin and then clamped his jaw down as hard as he could. Blood started to leak out into Naruto's mouth and Hitaki tried to shake him off, but he still had Naruto's arms held behind the boy's back so Naruto refused to let go. Naruto kicked out with his legs and struck Hitaki's torso, but the Jonin didn't so much as grunt. Naruto tried to get Purchase to push away, but Hitaki was like a steel cage holding him down. God, they were going to lock him up now, weren't they? That's what this was really all about. They were taunting him with freedom, with his dream, making him think that he was going to be a shinobi when really they thought he was too dangerous to walk around. They were going to throw him into a cell without any windows and it would be cold and dark and he could smell the earth closing in around him, ready to swallow him whole and imprison him for the rest of eternity. Hitaki abruptly twisted Naruto's upper arm, causing the boy to hiss through his teeth. "Naruto, calm down," Hitaki said firmly. Naruto stared up at Hitaki. His mouth was clenched around Hitaki's forearm and his heart pounded in his chest, nearly ready to rip its way out of his ribcage. As it gradually slowed down he realized he had been panicking, and that Hitaki was still holding him down instead of carting him off. Hitaki's expression, at least what he could see of it, looked unruffled and detached, like the professional killer he was. It kind of made Naruto want to hit him. Again, when Hitaki didn't seem inclined to knock him out, Naruto slowly released his arm. The man let him go and Naruto warily took a step away from him. "Better?" Hitaki said dryly. Naruto spat out the blood in his mouth and wiped his lips, though that just smeared the blood more. He held his head up high and said, "Yeah, well, you surprised me. You should know not to surprise a shinobi. You seemed more like a wild dog than a shinobi. What is this thing anyway?" Naruto asked. He thrust the wrist with the manacle toward Hitaki and ignored the comment. He was still shaking from what had not in any way been a panic attack, but he refused to show it or any other sign of weakness. "It's a chakra repressor. The interrogation and detention department use them to retrain their guests," Hitaki answered. "There are varying levels to suit shinobi with different chakra reserves. You have a ridiculous amount of chakra, which makes your ability to control it nearly non-existent. These have seals on them, see them, which will give you much better control." Naruto took the second manacle from Hitaki and held it away from him as though he expected it to come alive and bite him. Stranger things had happened before. There were minuscule seals carved into every visible surface of the metal, including the inner band. Naruto forced his shoulder muscles to loosen up as he continued to look it over. Why don't they just give their guests the highest level ones to make sure they can't use chakra at all? Hitaki shook his head. Repressing chakra completely can be fatal, which is generally counterproductive to interrogation. But for you, wearing these will be like turning down the faucet, to use your analogy from yesterday, he said. Naruto nodded slowly. He flexed his arm and tried to channel some chakra, and instantly felt the difference in the flow. After a moment of consideration he took a deep breath and put the second chakra repressor on. The sound of it clicking shut sent a shiver down his spine, but he stubbornly refused to flinch. Naruto looked up to find Hitaki watching him with that blank expression of his. Social conventions probably said that Naruto should thank him now for trying to help. Social conventions could go screw themselves. After a beat of silence Hitaki said, "Once you have better chakra control we'll switch them out for even weaker ones," and so on, until you're finally able to work well without them. That seems like it's an easier way than it should be to improve chakra control, Naruto said. Do I also have to sacrifice my blood every morning and pledge my non-existent soul to Jashin? Hitaki's single eyebrow rose. Jashin? I heard it on TV, Naruto said with a shrug. Of course. Well, you can pledge your soul to whoever you like, but really, using this method would kill most people, and even if it didn't, it would take years to get only marginal results. You, however, are a unique case. Because of the 9 tails was left unsaid. 3:30 p.m., the 12th of September 3:11 Tay. Naruto's apartment. Kakashi idly flipped the kunai that had nearly skewered him as he looked around Naruto's apartment. He'd never seen lethal traps like that before in an academy student's apartment. A Chunins or Jonins, sure, but an academy student who lived on their own. Well, I guess I can't be too surprised, all things considered, Kakashi mused aloud. He skirted around a few more trigger wires and opened the boy's fridge. There were a few containers of unidentifiable substances as well as a carton of milk that smelled slightly rancid. Kakashi picked it up, glanced at the sell-by date, and saw that it was almost 2 months old. The rest of the apartment was in a similar state. There were mostly ramen cups in the cupboards and the trash bin was overflowing. Naruto's tableware seemed to consist solely of used plastic cups, plates, and utensils, without a single piece of glass or ceramic in sight. Despite the clutter, it was primarily scrolls and textbooks that littered the floor of Naruto's living room, rather than trash. Kakashi glanced through one that laid open on the table and was surprised to find that the chapter on chakra basics had a myriad of detailed notes scribbled in margins. Perhaps he needed to take a closer look at Naruto's academy grades before he started teaching him, Kakashi thought. On the Hokage's orders, he'd been tailing the boy on and off for months now, but during that time he'd never noticed anything particularly odd about him. He paid attention in class, but his grades didn't reflect that. He had no real friends and spent most of his time training in the interior training grounds or playing pranks on seemingly random villagers. Kakashi opened the door to the tiny closet in Naruto's bedroom and a mess greeted him again. Scrolls shoved into the corners with dirty clothes hanging off them. And only a couple of hangers in sight. His wardrobe didn't have much variation, Kakashi thought. He poked at a t-shirt that had been stretched over a can of paint. With a small trace of guilt, he realized that the hideous orange and blue jacket he'd accidentally destroyed during Naruto's training had been the boy's only one. Without it, Naruto had taken to wearing the cheap black t-shirts that he seemed to have in droves, a handful of white t-shirts, and his loose orange pants. There were no other clothes in the closet. No extra pairs of pants, no coats, no socks. A flick of his wrist closed the closet. It was odd how many shirts Naruto had compared to everything else. He wondered if it spoke of how often Naruto ruined them and had to replace them. Kakashi took another minute to do a final cursory sweep of the apartment, carefully cataloging everything he saw so that he could do a more in-depth study of Naruto's habits at a later time. With a quick application of Shunshin, Kakashi disappeared from the apartment and made his way to the Hokage Tower. The Hokage knelt on the floor in his secondary office, silently puffing his pipe. His eyes were closed, and at first he didn't acknowledge Kakashi's presence. His chakra flared slightly and the unseen Anbu guardians vanished, leaving the two of them alone. His chakra flared again, activating the security seals that covered every square inch of the room, and then at last the third Hokage opened his eyes. Your thoughts? Kakashi placed his hands in his pockets and leaned back, the picture of nonchalance. I think I'll wait to see how he handles the 3 basic academy jutsu before I decide what to teach him, he said. The Hokage took another few puffs on his pipe, then took it out and laid it down at his side. You have been watching Naruto-kun for a while now. I would have thought you would know him well enough to already have a plan. Naruto is not what I expected, Kakashi replied with a shrug. I never had the chance to notice how quickly he heals, so it's difficult to gauge what else I may have missed. His mid-ranking grades made me believe he was an average student, until I learned about his complete lack of chakra control, which was rather understated in his file. We don't know how smart he is or how strong he is, or whether the 9 tails has any influence over him or not. He has been hiding for years, so I'm not prepared to make any assumptions on what he can do. With a heavy sigh, the Hokage nodded and asked, how did the chakra suppressors you ordered work out? Well enough, They didn't kill him at least, so he has even more chakra than I'd suspected. He had a severe panic attack when I first tried to put them on him though. I believe he may have some serious form of claustrophobia, from his time trapped in that cellar, I assume. Hokage-sama frowned heavily. You noticed no similar symptoms before this? Kakashi shook his head and said, no, nothing. He seems fine in closed rooms and I've seen him crawling through small spaces before. Keep an eye on him for now and report to me if you notice any other symptoms. Or if he has another panic attack, the Hokage said in a thoughtful tone. In 1 month you are to hand in a full psych evaluation on him and… He paused for a moment, pursing his lips. And advise what you believe his threat level is. Sir? The Hokage's eyes were like 2 hard pieces of flint, cold and unforgiving. Kakashi involuntarily straightened his back and clenched his fists. The Hokage could be terrifying even without an ounce of killer intent in the room. Honestly, at the moment I am more concerned with Danzo. He has become more active recently. I fear that Root might not be as disbanded as he has promised, he said. And even if that is not true, he has been pushing for me to turn Naruto into a weapon for years. There is no doubt in my mind that if he learned of Naruto's abilities, he would take matters into his own hands. I want you to keep a close eye on Naruto. If anything suspicious happens, either on Danzo's end or Naruto's, then bring the boy in. Shall I investigate Root as well? Kakashi asked, as quietly as you can. Use your Anbu cover for that while focusing on assessing and training Naruto in between. You have 6 months to get him fully caught up on the academy material, and then I will give you an official team. There was a note of finality in the Hokage voice that couldn't be taken for anything other than a dismissal. Kakashi bowed and disappeared in a swirl of smoke. In a dark upper corner of the room a small moth shook its wings and vanished. 10 a.m., the 8th of November 311 Te. Takagi residence. Oh, and you should have seen Lord Kenta. Takagi Shijimi, the fire daimyo's wife, prattled on. By the end of the night he was stumbling around like a common drunk. Lady Akemi was positively mortified. She gasped as though horrified, but her eyes were bright as she rapidly tapped her lips with her silk fan. How terrible, Danzo said evenly. He sat stiff-backed in a formal tea room and could already feel a dull ache settling into his knees. He ignored it. Shijimi sat across from him, along with her 16-year-old nephew, Takagi Akihito. The boy had not yet mastered the skill of continuing to appear interested in the conversation when he was actually uncomfortable. They would have to work on that. And speaking of which, don't you have your lesson soon, Akihito-kun? Shijimi said. Akihito nodded eagerly. He mumbled a quick goodbye, bowed politely, and left. His footsteps were slow and unhurried, but it was nonetheless obvious that he was fleeing from the room. Shijimi took a sip from her ornately decorated china cup and stared piercingly at Danzo from beneath her long lashes. I would prefer it if you didn't stare at my nephew like a piece of meat, she said. Danzo favored her with a smile. Of course, he agreed. So, Lord Saito is having troubles? Something related to his connection to the Yazuka, I presume. Possibly, Shijimi said as she tilted her head back. I am having Nama look further into it. If he owes more money than he can handle, we may be able to leverage it against him. Danzo nodded thoughtfully. Any word from Earth Country? Hiruzen will be meeting with the ambassador from Hidden Stone Village at the end of the month. From our intel, it is very likely that Lord Yamauchi will attend the Chunin exams. And since Lord Akamoto has already confirmed his attendance. Shijimi smiled. We'll have the Earth, Lightning, and Fire Daimyo all in one place. What about Lord Hiramu? Danzo shook his head. There is still too much unrest in Water Country's outlying islands, especially with the recent issues with the Mist Rebels. I would rather avoid any more daimyo at the exams regardless, he said dismissively. More lords will just mean more security and more variables. This operation will be difficult enough without that. The air across the room shimmered. Danzo looked up and watched as a large brown cat walked straight through the wall and into the room. The cat sauntered over to Shijimi, jumped into her lap, and began to purr under her hand. Tora, Danzo said with a slight incline of his head. Danzo, the cat said in the same tone. Do you bring us any interesting news? Danzo asked. Tora sneered. I bring you nothing. For Shijimi-sama, however, I have this. There is an Anbu watching the complex. He arrived when Danzo did. She tossed a look at the elder. And no, it's not one of yours. Do you think I am stupid enough not to be able to smell the difference? While Shijimi cooed over the beast, Danzo leaned back and considered her words. He had suspected that someone was following him recently, but his root guards had not been able to catch them yet. That was one benefit of the damn cat. He was forced to admit that his deal with Shijimi was smart, no matter how distasteful he found it to rely on an animal. Shijimi was very good at playing the part of a flighty, vain noblewoman who let her cat run wild. Only a handful of people in the elemental nations knew that Tora was a shinobi cat who actively spied for her. In return for the intel Tora gathered, Danzo regularly sent out genin missions to catch her, subtly obscuring her movements and giving her a reason to be hiding in the village in case she was caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. Only once had someone figured out what Tora could do. The man's body had made a good anatomy lesson for a few of the younger rude recruits. I should take my leave then, Danzo said aloud. Sarutobi is watching you, Shijimi inferred. Danzo smiled. I had better use that to my advantage then, He took his cane and used it to push himself to his feet. I will leave for the capital soon, but Akihito will remain here, Shijimi said. I swear to look after him, Danzo said. He leaned down and left a warm kiss on Shijimi's cheek. His cane clicked on the cherry hardwood floors as he departed. Once outside, Danzo spread out his chakra senses. A hazy chakra signature sat in an oak tree half a block away. It was so small and well cloaked that Danzo likely would have missed it had Tora not mentioned it. As he made his way out of the aptly named Flower District, it followed him at a distance, as per standard tracking protocol. In Anbu, like Tora had said, Danzo's chakra sensing ability was one of his best-kept secrets. Not even Sarutobi knew about it, and he intended to keep it that way. Hyper-aware of his tail, Danzo took his time making his way home and didn't relax until he had activated the privacy seals in his study. Rokuro, Danzo said. A black-clad shinobi appeared before his desk, already down on one knee. His head bowed and all Danzo could make of his face was a distinct but small crescent scar by his left eye. The shinobi waited, silent and still. Danzo wrote out a few lines on a blank scroll using a loose scrawl that looked nothing like his actual handwriting. When he finished, Danzo slid the scroll into a D-rank mission scroll case and held it out. The root shinobi stood and took it. I want you to interrupt the next courier from the daimyo, Danzo commanded. Then take this to the Hokage Tower. Make sure that Uzumaki Naruto gets it. The shinobi bowed and disappeared. The chakra from his technique had barely dissipated when someone else knocked on the door to his office. Danzo reached out with his senses and confirmed the person's chakra. Enter. A dark-haired boy slipped inside. I saw a flash of lightning, sir, he said. Danzo nodded. He dismissed the boy with a wave of his hand, then stood. He made his way into the tunnels hidden beneath his compound. They were a small part of a much larger network and seals lined its surface with the sole intent of keeping it carefully hidden. It took nearly a half an hour of walking before Danzo finally stopped before an innocuous stretch of wall. He placed his hand on one of the stones and sent a pulse of chakra into the seal hidden inside. The door opened smoothly and led him into a smaller subsection of the tunnels. Before long he walked into a hall lined with iron-bound doors. A masked root kunoichi dropped to one knee at Danzo's entrance. She kept silent as he moved past her and into the room she had been guarding. There were two shinobi inside, a second root operative and a shinobi who wore the uniform of Hidden Cloud Village. The latter was chained to a chair with chakra-repressing manacles and had a paper seal on his chest that left him paralyzed from the neck down. We picked him up near the border of Iron Country, the root nin said. I did nothing wrong. The Cloud Nin protested vehemently, sending spittle flying. I had papers allowing me to cross the border. Your guards were aware of my presence. Danzo set his cane down hard on the concrete floor and rested both hands on its knob. What is your name? He asked, voice devoid of any inflection. Special Jonin of Hidden Cloud Village. I am a medic nin, and I was. Danzo did not listen to the rest of the man's prattle. He considered him with hard eyes for a minute, then nodded. Pick 2 agents and reactivate Operation Thunderstorm, Danzo said to the root nin. The man bowed and vanished as a swirl of leaves. Danzo turned his head so that he could see the root kunoichi in the doorway from the corner of his eye. Activate Operation Hurricane, and tell Agent Sai to proceed with Phase 3 of Operation Wildfire. She nodded and stepped out of view. The Cloud Nin paled. He started to speak again, then cut himself off sharply when Danzo leaned forward on his cane until less than a foot of air separated their faces. Danzo reached up and pulled his bandages away from his left eye. A muscle in T's cheek began to twitch as horror dawned on him at the sight of the spinning Sharingan. "I have a special assignment for you," Danzo said. "Listen to me very carefully, and then follow my orders to the letter." 9 p.m., the 10th of November 311 Tay. Anbu Bolt Hole. Kakashi was halfway through lifting his Anbu mask to his face when he stopped and stared down at it. The porcelain felt ice cold in his hands and abnormally smooth. Had it always been that smooth? His fingers remembered faint bumps and irregularities, but he couldn't feel them anymore. It was hard to believe it had already been 2 years since he had retired from the Anbu Corps. Some part of him had expected life to slow down when he returned to being a regular Jonin, but he couldn't be too surprised that it hadn't. He had not retired to relax after all. He had been forced to retire because his abilities had gotten too infamous and recognizable. Now that he was a face of power for Leaf, he took more missions than ever, and most of them were high profile, and thus came with the added risk of incurring personal grievances against himself rather than rage at a faceless agent. Kakashi sighed faintly and lifted the mask to his face. A pulse of chakra activated the special seals on the lining of the mask and it stuck flush to his skin. There were added seals for breathability and to keep his skin cool and sweat-free so that he could wear it for days at a time without having to worry about comfort. A flick of his wrists pulled his cloak's hood forward, covering his signature silver hair. Kakashi double-checked the narrow, dirty mirror to ensure that it covered him completely. He looked like any other Anbu now, and the anonymity that came with the uniform settled around his shoulders like a familiar, comforting blanket. Not even other members of Anbu would be able to recognize him. Contrary to popular belief, mask designs were switched out every few missions to prevent individual Anbu from being identified. Kakashi sealed the bolt hole behind him and took to the roofs. It was dark enough that his cloak blended into the night and helped keep him semi-invisible. He found Danzo easily. He had been tailing the man for a few hours every couple of days for the past month, and while he had not witnessed anything overtly suspicious as of yet, he had noticed that the elder visited the Red Bean Cafe several times a week. And sure enough, there he was. Kakashi crouched in the shadow of a balcony as Danzo exited the building, relying on the shrouding seals of his cloak to suppress any chakra he could be giving off. He followed from a long distance, just barely close enough not to lose Danzo when he turned a corner. It would be easy for Danzo to duck away if he wanted to, but Kakashi wasn't trying to catch him, just follow him. Losing him was far less important than not getting caught. Danzo wound his way through the business district, but made no more stops. When it grew clear that he was heading to the Shimura compound, Kakashi readied himself to give up the night's surveillance as a loss. Then he saw a movement across the street. It might have been nothing, just an animal or a flickering light. Kakashi turned to look into the darkness regardless and sunk back further into the shadows. He channeled a minute amount of chakra into his eyes, just enough to enhance his vision for a moment, and the shapes of the buildings on the other side of the street flared into sharp relief. An Anbu crouched on a windowsill. Kakashi's eyes narrowed. He released his chakra and the lines of the buildings faded away as the darkness blurred his sight. The Hokage would have told him if another Anbu was investigating Danzo. So that likely meant root. It wasn't conclusive proof, not by a long shot, but it was something. The Hokage's fear might not be so unfounded after all. Kakashi waited, perfectly still, for several long minutes after Danzo passed by and the other Anbu followed after him. He did one last scan of the area, saw nothing, and used Shunshin to leave the area. He didn't stop running until he reached one of the Anbu safe houses. It was much larger than a bolt hole, taking up an entire upper floor above a print shop, but it was only a semi-permanent location. Kakashi sighed as he took off his cloak and mask, and began to strip off his Anbu armor. The door clicked open and another man stepped inside. Tenzo, Kakashi greeted him warmly. The man's face turned to him, perfectly blank, but Kakashi could read his surprise in the faint lines around his mouth. Kakashi-senpai. Special assignment, Kakashi said blithely in response to Tenzo's unvoiced question about why he was in uniform. How has Hyo been treating you? Has he gotten under your skin yet? No, sir, Tenzo answered. He has been a delight to work with. Ah, I won't rat on you, Sprout. Promise, Kakashi said, grinning broadly. I believe you, Senpai. Kakashi snorted and waved him off. I've got a surprise. I officially have a student. I am sorry, Tenzo said. For me or for him? Kakashi asked, and then laughed when Tenzo didn't reply. Actually, I may need your help with him eventually, should something go drastically wrong. Tenzo cocked his head to the side and considered Kakashi's words for a second. Uzumaki Naruto, he said, catching on as quickly as ever. Kakashi nodded. He's an interesting kid so far. Like your sensei? Tenzo asked. Kakashi flinched and didn't answer. He said instead, if you have a bit of time, I may be able to use your help. Of course, Senpai. I need you to help me trace Shimura Danzo's movements. 11 a.m., November 15, 3:11 Tay. Training Ground 16. Hitaki was a bastard. A strong bastard, granted, but still a bastard and really not much of a sensei. His teaching method was pretty much the equivalent of throwing Naruto down a hill, then tossing a boulder down after him. Naruto could take it, of course, but that didn't mean he hadn't broken nearly every bone in his body at some point during that past 2 months, on top of the hundreds of superficial cuts and bruises he got every day. And Naruto loved it, not in a masochistic way, but just the thrill of it. It was exhilarating to push his boundaries for the first time in his life, and doubly so to have a teacher who was solely focused on making him a better shinobi, even if he had to drag him over broken glass to do it. Naruto had never had that kind of attention before, ever, and he almost didn't know what to do with it. Over the 2 months since he had been promoted to genin, Naruto had quickly mastered the 3 Academy Jutsu, by performing them over and over and over until he nearly keeled over from exhaustion, which was no small feat considering his overabundance of stamina. Hitaki was still attempting to shape his taijutsu into something that marginally resembled an actual style. Personally, Naruto was much more comfortable brawling. Stop daydreaming and focus on our spar, Hitaki ordered as his hand shot past Naruto's guard and hit the boy's solar plexus, knocking the wind from his lungs. The bastard still didn't looking up from his book. Naruto wheezed and jumped out of Hitaki's range as he tried to get his breath back. You're a sadistic asshole, Naruto coughed even though he was grinning. I can still feel pain, you know. Are you saying you can't take it? Naruto's smile turned into a pout. No, stop twisting my words like that. The genin jumped away from another hit and ran up the tree next to him, using chakra to stick to it and then a moment later to push himself away. As he sailed over Hitaki, Naruto grabbed the man's shoulders and tried to pull him down along with him, but Hitaki used the Kawarimi jutsu to replace himself with a log. That was officially the most annoying technique ever, and if Naruto ever found out who first created it, he would happily dig up their grave, revive them with a super secret necromancy technique, and slowly torture them back to death. Of course, that didn't mean that 2 seconds later he didn't use the technique himself when Hitaki suddenly burst out of the ground beneath him and attempted to grab his ankles. Naruto had been caught in that technique once before and nearly freaked out again, an experience which he definitely did not want to relive. Sometimes it seemed Hitaki was always intent on using capturing techniques on him. Naruto glared down at his teacher from the upper boughs of a tree, silently glad that Hitaki had taught him the tree walking exercise. His chakra control had improved a lot in the past 2 months. It was still completely atrocious compared to pretty much every other shinobi ever, but he had moved down 1 level of chakra suppressors, and to him that was miracle worthy. Naruto still failed miserably whenever he tried water walking, no matter how much he practiced, but that was beside the point. He had never quite gotten used to the feeling of metal around his wrists though. Hitaki snapped his book close. Naruto stilled. He had come to greatly fear the times his teacher put that little orange books away, because it never meant anything good for him. Naruto had nightmares about it, damn it. How could orange be connected to something so completely evil? I think that's enough for today, Hitaki said. You've got a mission this afternoon. Naruto blinked at him. What? He said blankly, caught off guard. A second later his eyes lit up and he leapt to the ground to stand by Hitaki. Finally. It's been 2 damn months already. I thought you were waiting for the sage of the 6 paths to rise from the grave and ask you on date or something. He wondered if the sage of the 6 paths was the one who invented Kawarimi. That bared further investigation. You were still at academy level, despite my valiant efforts to improve your skills. However, thanks to my patient teaching you have finally risen above. The boy's eyes gleamed. Are you saying that I've got genin-level skills now? Naruto asked. Hitaki paused to reconsider what he'd said and Naruto perked up at idea that Hitaki was undoubtedly silently swearing in his head. The man would probably rather sleep with a porcupine than ever hand out a compliment. Yes, Hitaki said grudgingly at last. Naruto's smile widened to stretch across his face. Well, what are you waiting for, the 4th grade shinobi war? What's the mission? You still have to get it first. Meet me at the Hokage Tower, Hitaki said. And with a quick application of Shunshin he was gone. Naruto rolled his eyes, but he had become too used to Hitaki ditching him to be truly annoyed. Hefting a sigh, he took off at a run toward the village. As soon as he reached the outer district he took to the rooftops, marveling as always at the feeling of leaping through the air like a true shinobi. It was almost like flying. The trip ended much too soon. Naruto entered through one of the tall, open entries halfway up the tower, vaulting over a departing shinobi and using chakra to immediately come to a stop. Hitaki was already waiting there, and he led them deeper into the tower. They stopped in front of a wide doorway that led into a large room filled with activity. This, Hitaki said dramatically, is the mission center. The mission center was ultimately little more than a large, open room with half a dozen tables spread out near the walls. Each one was manned by a Chunin or two and had scrolls piled on top of them. The scrolls were all color-coded by table, which Naruto assumed separated them by rank or type or something. Hitaki casually walked up to the nearest table. Before he could say anything the Chunin there, a man with a crescent scar beneath by left eye, smiled and held out 2 scrolls. The first was in a red velvet container with gold lining and had some fancy seal that prevented it from being opened. There were even tassels hanging from the ends. Naruto shuddered just from looking at the blatant, ostentatious display of wealth. Bastards. The second scroll was green and little more than a scrap of paper in comparison. Perfect timing, the Chunin said. We need someone to take care of this D rank right away. It's a quick courier mission, so it only needs 1 person. I was thinking of something a little more challenging, like grocery shopping, Hitaki replied. Naruto's stomach lurched and he really hoped Hitaki was joking. Seriously, grocery shopping for a mission? The Chunin's polite smile never wavered. He was smiling with his eyes closed. Naruto noticed because that was what he did when he didn't actually want to smile at whoever he was facing. I'm sorry, Jonin-san, but I'm under strict instructions to give this mission out before any others, he said. Alright, Hitaki said with a put-on sigh. Naruto-kun, take the scrolls so we can get started. Naruto hurried up to the desk and took the 2 of them. The simple green scroll turned out to contain the actual mission parameters. In essence, he was to bring the red scroll to a manor in the outer district of Hidden Leaf Village. He frowned at the directions listed. If he had his bearings right, it was in the Flower District, where all the nobles from Keisha, Fire Country's capital, had their summer homes. Hitaki nudged Naruto's shoulder. Ready? You're coming with me? Do I look like I need babysitting for something like this? Naruto asked, scowling. He was a genin and it was just a courier mission, damn it. Hitaki quirked an eyebrow. I'm your sensei. I am required to come with you. But you're doing all the work. I won't say a word, he said. Yeah right, you'll just stand there looking pretty while silently praying that I'd trip and fall flat on my face. A shinobi never trips, Hitaki said with one of his patented closed-eye smiles. Naruto grumbled a bit more under his breath. Exactly. The manor, as it turned out, was a sprawling single-floor complex that reeked of tradition. A high stone wall encircled the grounds and several guards stood by the gate. The front lawn was less of a lawn and more of an extensive, carefully manicured garden. Naruto could even hear a small creek running somewhere on the property. What is your business? One of the armored guards demanded. Naruto held up the mission scroll. I'm looking for an, Takagi Akihito? I've got a scroll for him. The man eyed Hitaki suspiciously, his gaze lingering on his weapon pouches. Fine, the guard said. But just you, kid. Naruto glanced back at Hitaki. When the Jonin nodded, Naruto shrugged. It wasn't like he hadn't wanted to do this alone in the first place. Pushing his discomfort aside, Naruto followed the guard down a symmetrically laid stone path to the main house. He wrinkled his nose as they passed by a 7-foot-tall stone statue of some samurai warrior. There was a metal plaque at its base, but he couldn't make out what it said. Naruto also caught a glimpse of a large koi pond underneath a cherry blossom tree at the side of the complex, but he was ushered inside before he could do more than crane his neck to look. The chamber Naruto was led to had clearly been decorated for visitors. He shifted from foot to foot and looked around at the gold-framed paintings and ancient porcelain vases, and then grimaced down at the two-plush purple rug beneath his feet. He looked up when the shoji door slid open and an aging man with a goatee stepped inside. He folded his hands inside his traditional robes and regarded Naruto with cold eyes. "You have a scroll, Shinobi-san? Are you Takagi Akihito?" Naruto asked as he held up the red scroll. The man's lips thinned. "No, I am Sasaki, Akihito-sama's guardian," he said. "You will give the scroll to me." Naruto's hand froze and his gaze narrowed. "I was instructed to deliver this scroll to Takagi Akihito. And I am telling you to give it to me." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Sasaki-san." The fingers of Naruto's free hand twitched toward the weapon pouch strapped to his thigh. "I don't know if you're aware about how shinobi missions work, but when we are given instructions we follow them to the letter. I will only deliver this scroll into Takagi Akihito's hands." Sasaki peered down at Naruto over his nose with a sneer akin to a look one would give horse shit. "Akihito-sama is attending his lessons at the moment," he said. "If you are determined to meet with him, you will have to wait until they're done." "And how long will that take?" Naruto asked, squinting up at the noble. "Until dinner this evening, most likely." Nothing in Sasaki's tone or face said he felt smug, but Naruto was positive that he was anyway. "Fine," Naruto snapped. Sasaki bowed incrementally and backed out of the room. Naruto ran a hand through his hair. "Shit," he muttered. He couldn't really wait for that long. Hitaki would kill him, not to mention that Naruto would pretty much fail the mission by default. He seriously couldn't fail his first D-rank mission, not after the Hokage had personally pulled him out of the academy and made him a genin. That would be beyond humiliating in 100 different ways. He shifted uncomfortably and glanced around the parlor room. Naruto needed to find this Takagi guy, and from what the asshole had said, he should be somewhere within the complex. He just had to find a way to look around without getting caught and thrown out on his ass. His eyes lit up suddenly. He knew exactly what to do. It only took 2 hand seals to call up his chakra, a second of concentration, and a small puff of smoke, and then Sasaki stood in his place. Naruto tried to carefully school the expression of his henge into a stony mask, but a smile broke out on face twice before he managed to contain his glee. Naruto poked his head out into the hallway. It was empty in both directions, but he had come from the left, so he shuffled out of the room, carefully shut the door, and then tiptoed down the right wing of the hall. This was a real mission, Naruto thought giddily. Sneaking through a noble's mansion while in disguise, with the thrill of getting caught following his every step. This was what being a shinobi was all about. A door a few feet away slid open. Naruto froze. A middle-aged woman stepped out, but her gaze only flickered up to him for a half a second, then she bowed politely and kept her head down as she shuffled off. Naruto glanced into the room she'd come from, but it was just some kind of office. He paused in the doorway, his curiosity urging him to take a closer look even though there was a mission at hand. "Sasaki-sama?" Naruto jumped and spun around. A heavy-set old man approached from down the hall, a frown on his face. Naruto cleared his throat and straightened his back. Remembering Sasaki's disposition, he put a cold, haughty expression on and looked down at the old man. "What?" he snapped. The man's frown didn't go away, but it did lessen. "My apologies, sir," he said with a bow. "Was that all anyone did around here?" He hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something else, but thought better of it. Naruto had a sinking feeling that he wasn't doing a very good job of impersonating a nobleman. Naruto cleared his throat again and gave the old man a hard look. He lowered his tone a bit, trying to match Sasaki's voice more closely. "I need to speak with Akihito-sama urgently," he said, gesturing with the red scroll case, "and I don't have the time to hunt for him." The old man frowned further. Naruto held his breath and desperately prayed to whatever spirits were out there that this would work. The man's eyes suddenly slid away from him and his frown fell away. "This way, sir," he said. He turned on his heel and proceeded down the corridor. Naruto followed cautiously. The man led him around several corners and another short hallway before finally stopping in front of another shoji door that looked identical to all the others. He bowed and then wandered away distractedly. Naruto stared after him for a few seconds and shook his head. He put the regal noble asshole persona back on and slid the door open. The room almost looked like another office, except that there were 3 desks and the walls were lined with bookshelves that were filled with scrolls. There was a second door on the other side of the room and 2 people inside. A woman with tight bun and a severe expression, and a teenage boy who was about 5 years older than Naruto. The teen had average features and dark hair that was pulled into a long, loose braid that reached halfway down his back. The woman stopped speaking the second she noticed who had interrupted them and lowered the paper she had been holding up. "Sasaki-sama," she started. "Akihito-sama, I need to speak with you," Naruto cut her off. "Alone." The woman bowed smoothly and glided out of the room. Naruto eyed her, waiting until he was sure the door was completely closed, then strode over to Takagi. He held out the red scroll case. "This just came for you by courier Nin," he said. Takagi smiled and furrowed his brow at the same time, looking somewhat confused. "Is it urgent?" he asked. Naruto averted his eyes. "Yes." Just as the teen's hand closed around the other end of the scroll, the door behind Naruto abruptly crashed open. Naruto's head snapped toward the sound and then he froze, staring in horror at the furious countenance of the real Sasaki. "Oh, fuck." Naruto didn't think. He locked his gaze on the other door in the room, dropped his henge, and ran. There was a jerk from the other end of the scroll as Takagi held on, but Naruto dropped his end like it was on fire. He jumped over one of the desks, clipping a folder and sending papers flying, and slammed open the door. Naruto skidded on the hardwood floors as he made a sharp turn and wound up jumping onto the wall. He ran along at a 90-degree angle for a few seconds while using his chakra to stick to the wood and propel his movement. Then there was another, wider, door ahead, so he dropped back to the ground and just about smashed it open as he fled outside into the sunlight behind the residence. He stopped for a second as his feet touched the grass, whipping his head around and trying to figure out which way would take him out of the compound the quickest. The door suddenly closed behind him and Naruto spun around again. He opened his mouth, ready to unleash a tirade of explanation, but the words dissipated into thin air like water hitting a hot pan when he saw that it was Takagi standing behind him, not Sasaki. "This way," the teen said urgently. He dashed around the nearest corner of the building and Naruto followed almost without thinking. He heard the door to the building being harshly thrown open again, but both of them were already out of sight and then Takagi hurried him through a small doorway and into some kind of storage room. It took all of 2 seconds for Naruto to realize that he had just disappeared with a nobleman's son. "Why did you follow me?" Naruto asked. Takagi flicked a switch that flooded the space with more light. There were gardening tools hanging on the walls and several coiled water hoses lay on the floor where they had been thrown inside. The teen breathed rapidly, his eyes bright with excitement. "Sorry," Takagi said sheepishly. "It's just, you ran, and Sasaki looked so angry, and..." He tried to look contrite, but a smile kept slipping onto his face and it wasn't long before Naruto grinned alongside him. "Did you see his expression?" Naruto said eagerly. "That was better than when I..." He cut himself off and swallowed the rest of the story he'd been about to tell about one of his pranks. Instead he scratched the back of his head and said, well, it was funny. And sorry about surprising you and all. I was supposed to deliver a scroll to you but that asshole, your guardian wouldn't let me interrupt your lessons, so I just kind of..." Laughter bubbled over Takagi's lips. He stopped almost instantly and flushed in embarrassment, as though he wasn't supposed to laugh, and looked at Naruto with something akin to amazement. "I have never seen an illusion up close like that before," Takagi said. "It was quite fantastic." Thanks." Naruto shook his head. "Shouldn't you be more, careful, or something? What if I'd been an enemy shinobi? Oh, I always have one of my uncle's guardians looking after me. You would not have been able to get into the compound without Nama-san noticing you. And we are in the middle of the Hidden Leaf Village, one of the safest places in Fire Country." "Your uncle?" Naruto asked. Takagi started. Yes. My uncle is Takagi Hirohito." Naruto blinked at him, not sure if that was supposed to mean something. Takagi stared back and Naruto had a feeling that they were both missing something. "Takagi Hirohito, the fire daimyo." Naruto kept on staring. He knew Takagi was a noble, but this? How was he supposed to treat the nephew of a daimyo? Should he bow like the other people in the compound? Not that he ever would, but… That's nice, he heard himself say distantly, then flushed and waved his hands around. I mean, I just wasn't expecting that. What are you doing in Leaf Village if you're, special and all? My aunt, Shijimi, is vacationing here, Takagi said amusedly. I agreed to come with her, though I would not have if I had been given a choice. Not that there is anything wrong with Hidden Leaf Village. I do not spend much time with my relatives. I always have to study this subject or that, working on mathematics or economics or poetry or 1,000 other things. Definitely different from the training I do, Naruto mused. He glanced toward the storage room door. Speaking of which, do you think your guardian has stopped his rampage yet? We should probably go before he decides I've kidnapped you. Takagi chuckled and nodded brightly. He stepped past Naruto and opened the doors, but stopped in the shade of the manor and looked back. Thank you for delivering the scroll directly to me. It's likely nothing more than another correspondence from my uncle, but I appreciate it nonetheless. Most others would have left it with Sasaki and thought nothing more of the matter. Naruto softly closed the door behind him. Sure, no problem, he said, puffing out his chest. I'm a damn good shinobi and I have a 100% mission success rate. He thought it better not to mention that this was his first ever mission. You surely must be, Takagi said with a laugh. He paused suddenly, eyes widening. Oh, my apologies, I never asked for your name. Uzumaki Naruto. Nice to meet you, Takagi-san. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. It is rare that I get the chance to speak with a leaf shinobi, and even rarer someone close to my own age, Takagi said. Naruto waved him off. Yeah, well, I've never spoken to a noble before, so I guess we're even. He noticed the grass nearby rustling slightly. It stopped a moment later and he dragged his gaze back up to Takagi. I'm glad you got the scroll and all, but I really need to go before my sensei kills me for taking so long. Takagi nodded. I will be sure to confirm that Sasaki has calmed and to let your Hokage know that I appreciate your efforts. Naruto paled so quickly that it looked like he'd been dashed with flour. He hadn't even considered how what he'd done might look to his superiors. He had been focusing completely on completing his mission, but in the process he had impersonated a nobleman, trespassed, and then disappeared with the daimyo's nephew. Sounds good, Naruto said weakly. Make sure to stress that I am an awesome shinobi with only the mission's best interests at heart. Certainly, Takagi said while hiding a smile behind his hand. Abruptly Naruto stomped on the ground, catching the tail of a snake beneath his foot. The snake hissed and in a flash whipped around to bite his ankle, right below the hem of his pants. He grimaced as its fangs pierced his flesh, and then drove a kunai through its skull and pinned it to the ground. Damn, Naruto muttered. I'd forgotten that these things are more common at this end of Hidden Leaf Village. Not to mention that he spent most of his time at the training grounds, where animals were rare to non-existent. He wiped the kunai clean on his pants, letting the snake fall back into the grass. Takagi was spluttering, dumbstruck. That was a mamushi, he said. Yeah, well, it's a dead mamushi now. It bit you. Takagi sounded genuinely horrified. You must go to a doctor. They are the most poisonous snakes in Fire Country. Even if that were true, the poison was probably already cleansed from Naruto's system already. Don't worry, I'll be fine. I'm a fast healer. It's a shinobi thing, he added, glad that Takagi wouldn't know any better. Takagi looked down at Naruto's ankle dubiously. He shook his head. I truly cannot understand how confident you are, he said. Naruto shrugged uncomfortably. It's nothing, really, he insisted. Anyway, my mission is done so I should go. I will show you to the entrance, if it pleases you, Takagi said. It's no problem. I can just use the wall. Oh, right. An awkward silence fell between the two of them. They must have made an odd sight. Takagi dressed in a dark yukata and Naruto in an orange and black shinobi outfit, with a dead snake between them. Naruto sketched a quick bow in the noble's direction and made a beeline for the wall. 12:30 p.m., November 15, 3:11 Tay. Takagi residence. Once Naruto left and Akihito had returned inside, a green-haired man with a small cross-shaped scar on his lower cheek jumped off the manor's roof and landed in the grass near the storage room door. He kneeled down and picked up the dead snake. He opened its mouth with one thumb to get a look at its fangs, then smiled. "This is yours, I assume," Nama said. A shadow detached itself from the building and stepped forward, revealing a shinobi with a root mask. He held his hand out and Nama handed over the snake. "What do you need a blood sample for, I wonder?" Nama mused, tilting his head to the side. After a long moment of silence, he continued. "Not going to tell me anything? That is your usual style, I suppose. Is that why you helped the boy inside as well, by casting that genjutsu on the servant to lead him to Akihito-sama?" Still the root nin kept his silence. Nama chuckled softly and turned away with a wave. He jumped back onto the roof and felt the root nin vanish before his feet even touched the tiles. 9 a.m., December 13, 3:11 Te. Training Ground 16. "This is chakra paper," Hitaki said. He held up a square of paper about half the size of an explosion tag. A second later a faint crunching sound came from it as it suddenly crinkled up. "Paper that ruins itself?" Naruto replied. "How useful." "It's chakra paper," Hitaki repeated. "As you know, most jutsu are elemental in nature. The stronger affinity you have for a particular element, the more easily you can learn to use it, and to change your chakra's nature to it. You follow? No, I'm just watching your lips move for the hell of it." Hitaki ignored Naruto's sarcasm with an ease born from months of practice. Naruto sighed. It was getting more and more difficult to get a rise out of his teacher, which meant more boredom for him. "Does this mean you're going to start teaching me more jutsu?" Hitaki gave his closed-eye smile. "Naturally. But as I said, first we have to find out what your affinity is. And that's where chakra paper comes in. This paper is made from a special type of tree that is fed with chakra as it grows. When you channel a bit of chakra into it, it will react depending on the latent nature of your chakra. If you are lightning-natured, it crumples. Wind-natured, it gets cut in half. Fire-natured, it burns. Water-natured, it gets wet. Earth-natured, it turns to dust. So it's still paper that ruins itself," Naruto pointed out. "Then think of it as samurai paper that blindly sacrifices itself for the sake of your training," Hitaki retorted. Naruto snorted, amused. Hitaki took out a fresh piece of chakra paper and handed it to the boy. Naruto quickly snatched it up, curious about what his element would be. This was the sort of stuff that they barely even touched on in the academy. Not that the academy taught them much in the first place, in his opinion. He had learned more from Hitaki that autumn than he had in his years of schooling. Tossing such thoughts from his mind, Naruto eagerly channeled his chakra into the paper. Perhaps a bit too much, as the paper instantly split in his grip with enough force to jerk his hands apart. Naruto grinned widely. "Wind it is. So, what jutsu are you gonna teach me?" Don't get ahead of yourself," Hitaki said. "Before you can start learning jutsu, you have to familiarize yourself with how to mold your chakra into wind-natured chakra. And to do that, we're going back to the basics." He held up a single leaf, smiling widely enough that Naruto could just see it through his mask. Oh, he was definitely a sadistic bastard. Naruto took the leaf and stared down at it spitefully. "What am I supposed to do, blow it around with wind?" He held it up to mouth and blew, making it flutter away. "Look, I'm a windmaster. Now what about the jutsu?" Hitaki rolled his eyes. "If that's you using chakra, then I think we need to up your suppressors again." Naruto tightly crossed his arms before him, keeping his wrists hidden, and glared at Hitaki. "No?" the Jonin said with another smile. "Then let's continue. I want you to place the leaf in your hand and using only your chakra, split it into 2 equal halves. Won't this be fun?" "Oh yeah? No problem," Naruto growled. "I'll have this done in a matter of minutes." Hitaki chuckled in a condescending, "I know something you don't sort of way." "Oh, I highly doubt that," he said. "It takes some shinobi years to master how to alter the nature of their chakra. This exercise is something that I want you to work on in between the rest of your training, when you have some extra time. For now, you have another mission. Race you there." He used Shunshin to vanish, and was probably already at the Hokage Tower. Naruto picked up another leaf and tucked it away in one of his pockets. He wanted to finish the exercise soon, so he would do so, and it was as simple as that. People like his academy instructors had quickly learned that when Naruto wanted to finish something, he did so. They'd bet that he couldn't memorize the entire textbook chapter on the First Shinobi War in an afternoon, and then he came out and blew their minds. That week he made their wallets cry and ate like a daimyo. He also never told them he cheated, but if they, shinobi, couldn't figure it out, then Naruto sure as hell wasn't going to say a word. Chunin teachers always made the best targets anyway. They were strong enough to be confident about their skills but just weak enough that their arrogance blinded them to simple, obvious solutions. Patting his pocket once to make sure that the leaf was secure, Naruto took off after Hitaki. As soon as he left the training grounds, he took to the buildings and roof-hopped toward the center of town. He really needed to learn Shunshin soon if Hitaki intended to keep taking off and leaving him behind. Naruto, though, he would get used to it after months of working with the man, but it was still annoying as hell, especially since he had at least one mission a day now. Most of the missions were simple ones, like cleaning up garbage or chasing down some cat, that he could do alone, but every now and then he was paired up with a team of other genin. D-rank missions were also pitifully boring. It was almost a waste of time that Naruto could be using to train, except that he got paid, which made them worth it. Today, however, turned out to be one of those days that he was foisted off onto the closest unsuspecting team. A familiar, very loud, very green team. My eternal rival. Maeda Guy boomed with his arms spread wide and his mouth forming a blinding grin. It is an honor that we have a chance to work together again. In the blink of an eye, Hitaki was gone, leaving Naruto alone with the green beast. It would seem he has many hip things to do today. But I am glad he took the time to drop you off, Naruto-kun. Maeda said, not looking the slightest bit put off at Hitaki's abrupt escape. He was probably used to it. Yeah, me too, Naruto muttered. He made a mental note to put some frogs in the bed of his dear teacher when he had the chance. 3 genin followed Maeda into the mission center at a more sedate pace. Naruto knew them as Utatane Tenten, Hyuga Neji, and Lee. Lee had never given his surname and started spouting off about the flames of youth when Naruto asked, so he just let it slide, no matter how uncomfortable he was with the familiarity of calling someone by their given name. Great, Hyuga scoffed when he saw the blonde-haired genin. Try not to get in our way this time, boy. Yeah, because I was the one who broke the fence while painting it, Naruto said dryly. Hyuga stared coldly at him and turned his nose up, so Naruto glared back. He had been on 2 joint missions with this team before, and both times he'd found that Hyuga had a bigger stick up his ass than most of the Chunin he knew. Naruto hated people like him. Let's receive our glorious mission, Maeda exclaimed before Hyuga could reply. Our flames of youth will push us on to victory. The glorious mission turned out to be an investigation. Chickens? Naruto repeated incredulously. We're looking into the death of some chickens? The Chunin behind the desk gave him a dull look. They keep turning up dead even after a fence was put up, and the client wants to know what the cause is. He claims it's a ghoul, so we need you to find out what's actually going on, he said, bored with the entire procedure. A chicken-eating ghoul? That had to be the worst explanation Naruto had ever heard. He bit back a yawn as the Chunin finished his explanation and gave them directions to the client's house. Naruto followed casually behind the rest of his temporary team as they headed out, secure in the knowledge that this was probably going to be one of the more boring missions he'd been on recently. 10:30 a.m., December 13, 311 Te. Hidden Leaf Village, Southern Quarter. Utatane took the lead and rapped smartly on the door. For a moment there was no response, then they heard someone shuffling around inside. A moment later the door opened and a middle-aged man with dark bags underneath his eyes poked his head out. His gaze flickered over the genin's outfits and he sagged like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Trembling noticeably, he gripped the doorframe and Naruto thought it was probably the only thing holding him up. Frankly, he looked like shit. Thank God, the man muttered. I thought you weren't coming. Utatane looked concerned. With a furrowed brow she asked, Sir, are you alright? The man shook his head, but didn't seem to have heard her question. I can't sleep, or work, or think. His voice dipped down low, growing hoarse as he shivered. It started a few weeks ago when my chickens started disappearing. I thought it was just some foxes or dogs getting into the pea pen at first, so I had a new one installed, but it kept happening anyway. I found the gate unlatched a few times, like a person had gone in, so I stayed up one night waiting to catch the thief. I saw. He shuddered violently this time and slipped down the doorframe. Lee stepped forward quickly and grabbed the man before he could fall. Half holding him up, Lee helped the man to sit down on the steps, then ran inside and returned a minute later with a glass of water. The man smiled gratefully as he took a sip. Naruto never would have said it aloud, but he found himself marginally impressed by Lee's manners. He had taken Lee for more of a punch-it-until-it-submits type of person, like him. "What did you see?" Hyuga demanded bluntly. Naruto repressed a snort. There was another surprise. He thought nobles like the Hyuga were supposed to be the ones with good manners. Hyuga Neji was more like a pit bull with a burr in his foot. Naruto wondered if Hyuga had always been this sullen, or if he had been dropped on his head as a child. When he could speak again, the man continued, "I saw a dark shape. It was a great beast, the size of a bear, but long and lean. I've never seen anything like it before. It reached up and undid the latch on the G-gate with some sort of unholy magic." Another shudder ran through him. It was some kind of malicious spirit or demon. It didn't even make a S sound in the grass and left no tracks on the ground. God, he sounded like an old radio Naruto had once tried to salvage that had its gears sticking out its back. He hadn't been able to fix the radio and eventually tossed it, and now felt like he was about 2 seconds from doing the same with this man. Naruto turned away and rolled his eyes. Utatane caught his gaze and gave him a look. She shushed the man and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll go take a look around the area," she assured him. "Did you see anything else?" He hesitated. "I found the bodies of a few chickens down near the lake. They were mostly eaten and had been there for a while, sunken in the water and covered by branches. No animal would know to hide them like that," he insisted vehemently, half rising from the steps. "It's not natural." Utatane firmly pushed him back down and he sat with an explosive sigh. "We will take a look," she repeated. "Stay here, we'll be back in a bit." She straightened, jumped off the steps, and then began walking around the side of the house with long, quick strides. Lee followed her immediately, so with his own silent sigh Naruto did as well. It seemed to Naruto that this mission was going to be more trouble than it was worth. The client clearly had a one-way ticket to Hidden Leaf Village's mental asylum. And even if there really was a ghoul, why was he so afraid of it? It had only eaten his chickens, never attacked him or caused damage. All signs pointed to the cause of his fears being harmless as a declawed kitten with an appetite for chicken wings, hopefully the spicy kind, which were Naruto's favorite. Their client was jumping at shadows like the superstitious old man he was. At the back of the farmhouse was a large wooden chicken coop that was almost half the size of Naruto's apartment. A 5-foot-tall wire fence surrounded the yard around the coop, and no chickens were in sight. Utatane flicked the latch on the gate. Naruto paused at the sight of it, suddenly less sure of himself. "It requires opposable thumbs to open," Utatane announced as she pressed up on the bottom of the latch, showing how it worked. The veins around Hyuga's face bulged as he activated his eyes. He tilted his head slightly, then released a breath of air and deactivated the Byakugan. "There is nothing unusual around. There are only chickens inside the coop and no other living beings apart from the client and the animals," he said. "What if it really is a spirit?" Lee said with awe in his voice. "We will split up," Hyuga said authoritatively. "I'll head down to the lake where the client said he found the hidden corpses. Tenten, you check the eastern part of the property. Lee, head through the forest on the western part and see what you can find. Uzumaki," he turned his nose up again. "You can stay around the building in case the spirit comes back." Part of Naruto wanted to flip Hyuga off and tell him exactly where he could put his bossy attitude. A larger part of Naruto, however, rose up and reminded the angry part of him that Hyuga was accidentally handing him a free pass to do nothing for this mission and still get paid, something which Naruto eagerly jumped on. Grinning widely, Naruto reached over and slapped Hyuga on the shoulder. "Sounds good to me, boss man. I'll see you guys when you get back, yeah?" Hyuga froze like a deer that had just seen its family murdered in cold blood. He opened and closed his mouth, then his face grew red and he spun around and stalked off with as much grace as he could manage. Utatane rolled her eyes and headed around the house to the east while Lee took off toward the trees. Naruto rolled his shoulders in an easy shrug and took a seat on the ground up against the back of the house. He wondered briefly if he'd still get his pay for the mission if he took off now. Hyuga would probably rather pretend he'd had control of Naruto the whole time than admit that he bailed. Naruto caught a flash of movement out of the corner of his eye. Frowning, he turned his head to the left. The deck of the client's house stretched out a good half a dozen feet from the building. It was raised up off the ground by nearly 2 feet, and through the bushes that surrounded it he could see only darkness and the space beneath it. Naruto was about to look away when he saw the movement again, barely noticeable in the darkness. Suddenly alert, Naruto palmed a few shuriken in one hand while using the other to push himself up into a crouched position. He couldn't see anything beneath the deck, but he trusted his instincts more than his eyesight. It never occurred to him to call for backup, one of the downsides to being accustomed to being on a one-man team. He just crept up to the deck and stopped in front of the bushes. Naruto wondered if it really was a spirit like the client thought. More likely it was a homeless civilian with some basic shinobi training who was bumming off this property. His hand tightened on his shuriken at that thought, but an academy dropout was definitely something he could handle. He could think of better places to hide than under a deck though. "You can come out now," Naruto said. "I can take apart the entire deck if I need to, but I'd rather not put out that much effort today." Nothing moved in the darkness. Naruto frowned, then sighed. Fine, he said nonchalantly. It was too bad that Naruto didn't know any fire jutsu. That would have gotten whoever was down there out pretty quickly. Instead, he reached into one of his pouches and withdrew a small pocket flashlight that he always kept with him. He turned it on and flashed the light through the darkness. The face of a tiger was illuminated only a few feet away. Naruto yelped in shock and scrambled backward. Holy shit! Naruto began swearing loudly as he jumped back onto his feet. He balanced there on the balls of his feet for a moment, tense and waiting for an attack that didn't come. Naruto's frown deepened when once again nothing moved in the darkness beneath the deck. Half wondering if it was just a statue or something that had been left there, he slowly approached the bushes again, this time holding a kunai out in front of him while holding the flashlight in his other hand. As the light pierced through the darkness beneath the deck, the tiger was once again illuminated. It blinked slowly at him. Naruto sucked in a breath of air sharply, but still the tiger didn't move. He stared at it, having never seen one before. It was lying on its side and its eyes were bloodshot and droopy. To Naruto it looked like it was exhausted and sick. He could literally see its ribs through the fur of its hide. He doubted it could leap at him even if it wanted to. "So you're the client's ghoul," Naruto mused to himself. That didn't answer the question of how it had opened the latch on the chicken pen though, or how Hyuga had missed it when he'd looked around with his Byakugan. Wasn't it supposed to see through walls and everything? Naruto sighed aloud. Well, at least now he could see Hyuga's face light up with frustration when he found out Naruto'd already completed the mission. The tiger opened its maw and a loud pant came out. It panted again and then, almost so quietly that Naruto couldn't hear it, said, "Food." Naruto stared. There was no way in hell he'd just heard the tiger talk. He was obviously hearing things and had gone insane much faster than he was expecting. "Please," the tiger panted. Naruto swallowed the protests that had been building in his throat. If there was one thing he believed, it was that no one deserved to starve. "Just hold on," he said, and stood slowly. Leaving the property was easy enough. It didn't take Naruto long to head into the market district and find a butcher willing to sell him a large chunk of deer meat, though hauling it back was a fair deal harder. He managed to get it back to the deck without anyone noticing or asking questions. Thankfully his temporary teammates were nowhere in sight. When Naruto dropped the meat, large enough for several steaks, in front of the tiger, it stared for a moment. Then in a burst of energy it tore into it, gobbling it down in a few massive bites. When it had finished it licked its chops, set its head down on its paws, and tiredly closed its eyes. Naruto drew back from the bushes and sat down on the ground. Staring down at his hands, he silently asked himself what he was doing. He found a talking tiger underneath a civilian's deck and his response was to feed it. He must have been more screwed up than he thought. He was still sitting in silence when Utatane came back half an hour later. "Nothing," she said with a sigh. "Not even any tracks. I'm starting to wonder if it's not just in the client's head." She grimaced. Hyuga and Lee joined them shortly with similar results. Hyuga had found no sign of the corpses the client had claimed were hidden there, and Lee hadn't even come across any wildlife in the woods around the property. Naruto silently wondered if the tiger had scared them all away. Somehow he just couldn't open his mouth and point out the tiger lying behind him under the deck. Even when Hyuga sneered at his uselessness, Naruto just stared at him until he grew unnerved and looked away. "Hello my youthful students," Maida exclaimed when he joined them. "How has your mission gone?" "We couldn't find anything," Utatane said with a shake of her head. "There wasn't even any evidence that chickens have been dying." "I told you, he is just a crazy old man," Hyuga said with a derisive scoff. "There must be something we have missed," Lee said. He was always quick to defend people, Naruto had noticed. Hyuga scoffed again. "I had my Byakugan on and I couldn't see anything near the lake." "It's no dumping ground," he said. "A few chickens probably escaped and the client is taking it as being the work of a spirit." "It's ridiculous. You're unusually quiet, Naruto-kun," Maida observed. Naruto shrugged wordlessly. He could almost feel the tiger watching from behind him. Naruto came back to the client's home the next day. Their mission had been categorized as incomplete, rather than failed, pending a psych evaluation for the client, but he couldn't keep his mind off it. The tiger was under the deck right where he had last seen it. It watched Naruto from beneath lidded eyes as he crouched down in front of the opening beneath the deck, but didn't move. Naruto dropped another hunk of meat in front of it, barely holding back a wince at the sound of his hard-earned money being thrown away. Again the tiger devoured it in seconds, but it didn't look any healthier than the day before. If anything it looked sicker. "You're a summoned beast, aren't you?" Naruto said after a moment. "That's the only way you could talk, if you were a summon." There was a rumbling in the back of its throat, but it didn't otherwise reply, so he continued. "I thought summons were supposed to go back to wherever they came from when they're done though. Or can't you leave?" Silence was the only response he got. The tiger shut its eyes completely and seemed to drift off into sleep. Gritting his teeth, Naruto quickly left. 1 p.m., February 3, 3:12 TE. Hidden Cloud Village. Ni Yugito had never liked blood. It was an odd quirk for a kunoichi, but he had once said that all suitably powerful shinobi had at least one weird quirk. It was a mental defense against the stress that came with their job. The face of the shinobi before her was slackened in death. His skin looked gray and waxy, more like a carving than a person. The carpet underneath him had been stained burgundy from the pool of blood surrounding the body. The dark shade told her that it had mostly dried, putting the time of death at an hour ago or more. No signs struggle, Omoi mused thoughtfully. And he still had all his kunai on him. Yugito tapped her fingers in a rhythmic pattern on her thigh. There was only a single wound on the body, straight through his chest. No other scratches or bruises. As Omoi had said, no signs of a struggle. The rest of her team, Omoi, Yatsuki, and Karui, rifled through the rest of the apartment while she stared down at the corpse. "When will the medic Nin arrive?" Yugito questioned. They would need to test for poisons and toxins, though she doubted that the assassin would have used anything that would remain in his system for too long. She had only known the victim, a Jonin named Jay, in passing, but she did not believe that he would have made an easy target. The assassin had to have been quite skilled to dispatch him without a fight. They should be on their way. Mabui-san said that she'd send someone from the hospital, Omoi said. "Why the hell are we being given a goddamn murder investigation?" Karui grumbled. "I thought we were supposed to be a strike team." Yatsuki pinned the red-haired kunoichi with an annoyed look. "One of our own was killed within the walls of our village. That speaks of traitors or infiltrators, or both. If you do not view protecting your own as a worthy mission." "That's not what I meant and you know it." Karui snapped, her dark skin blushing red. A knock sounded at the door and everyone froze. Yugito turned smoothly toward its direction and said, "Enter." A shinobi with slanted eyes and dark hair hidden under a bandana-style forehead protector stepped inside and nodded politely. "Yugito-sama. Sorry for the delay," he said. "T-san," Yugito greeted, smiling lightly. "We appear to have an assassination. I need you to confirm the cause of death and check for any unusual substances in his system." She glanced down at the body again and ran her eyes over it. "Check his brain cells for any signs of genjutsu tampering." T's eyebrows lifted, but he nodded instead of asking questions. He knelt down next to the corpse and the carpet squelched where the blood had soaked in too thickly for it to dry completely, but he didn't seem to notice. T's hands glowed green with medical chakra as he started to move his hands over the body, hovering a few inches above its skin. While he worked, Yugito turned back to the members of her team. Yatsuki, check the perimeter of the building at street level. Karui, check the surrounding rooftops. Omoi, look for any chakra impressions that might have been left. The three shinobi nodded as one and the louder members of her team disappeared. Omoi sat cross-legged on the floor near the door, rested his hands on his knees, and closed his eyes. Yugito folded her arms behind her back and returned to watching T. The medic Nin had his tongue sticking out of the corner of his mouth as he worked, and Yugito had to suppress a smile at the sight. There's nothing in his bloodstream, T announced a minute later. There is minor tissue necrosis around the edges of the wound on his chest, which would suggest the use of chakra rather than a weapon. Based on the lack of burned skin and the clean border, probably a raw chakra technique. I can't quite tell whether he was under a genjutsu. He's been dead too long, so there's not enough latent chakra left in his system. My preliminary diagnosis would be that it's unlikely he died while under a genjutsu though. Nodding silently, Yugito started to form a picture of the assassination in her head. Jay had been attacked by a chakra specialist with a raw attack, which meant the assassin had precise chakra control. The attack took place in the living room while Jay was awake. Why hadn't the assassin waited a few hours until Jay was asleep? They were obviously capable of getting around the traps if they broke in anyway, unless they hadn't. Unless Jay knew the assassin and let them in, and then was attacked while his guard was down. As a Jonin, it was unlikely that Jay would have been fooled by an imposter, which meant. Yugito's lips thinned. It looked increasingly likely that someone Jay knew and trusted had killed him. Was this a domestic dispute? Or the work of a highly skilled infiltrator? Omoi opened his eyes and released a pent-up sigh. Nothing, he said. Yugito didn't let the frown she wanted to wear show. Go gather Karui and Yatsuki, she said. When Omoi had gone, she turned all of her attention back onto T. Thank you for your assistance, T-san. Please submit a report with the Raikage's office after you have finished here and taken the body to the morgue. T nodded. Of course, Yugito-sama. She repressed a sigh as she left the apartment. Just because B insisted that everyone call him Killer B-sama, they did the same with her, regardless of how much she protested. Yugito shook her head and smiled fondly. It wasn't the only example of B's odd quirks, just the most far-reaching. A civilian woman peeked out from another apartment as Yugito passed by. Is everything all right? She asked, trying to sound concerned but only managing to come off as eager. Yugito gave her a wan smile. Most civilians were keen to stay out of shinobi matters, but as a result those who were still curious tended to be gossip mongers. Fine, ma'am, she said. Just shinobi business. The woman nodded. Oh, I know. I saw T-san come by a minute ago. Poor boy. He must be taking this hard. He and Jay were such good friends. Yugito pulled up short. Yes, she agreed lightly, he must be. She gave the woman a pointed look until she sheepishly closed her door, then flashed back to Jay's apartment. She slammed the door open just as a flash of white light lit up the center of the room and the corpse disappeared. There was no body storage scroll in sight. T stared up at her, surprise and guilt written across his face. Yugito's eyes narrowed. She channeled chakra into her fingernails and they smoothly lengthened into foot-long claws. Care to explain? She said. T stayed very still, like a mouse watching a hawk and not daring to make any sudden movements. He did not respond or try to defend himself. His fingers twitched. Yugito felt the chakra before she saw the table move, pulled by chakra strains. She dove forward, rolling underneath the furniture as it flew overhead and into the wall behind her with a mighty crash, and then pulled her claws up in time to block a chair. Her hardened nails bit through the wood with ease, sending splinters flying in every direction. Instead of fleeing like Yugito expected, however, T jumped right at her, through the debris. He tried to slam his shoulder into hers and body check her, but Yugito spun away from the blow and drove her claws into his side. T dodged at the last second and blurred into three figures. Yugito slashed out at them and the nearest two broke apart and dissipated like a cloud blown by the wind, while the third made a break for the front door. She ignored it and instead turned toward the open balcony doors on the other side of the apartment. Focusing, she manually molded her chakra for a jutsu, and then released it. Lightning raced down the tips of her claws and shot across the balcony. A scream rent through the air as the lightning hit T's invisible body in midair as he jumped. Whatever jutsu he'd been using flickered and failed, and his flailing body fell toward the ground. Yugito launched herself over the balcony after him. Several more yells rang out below when T landed with a crunch and the civilians on the street wisely backed away as Yugito appeared nearby. "Please surrender, T-san," she said. "I would prefer to finish this altercation with words, rather than bloodshed." "Yugito-sama," Yatsuki called out as he shouldered his way through the fleeing crowd. T twitched on the ground. He tried to push himself up, but wound up collapsing again. Yugito strode closer, claws held out warily. A faint sheet of chakra coated her body, reaching out and sensing. Before her eyes could even widen, Yugito spun on her heel. A warning died on her lips as T appeared behind Yatsuki with one hand glowing with chakra pressed to Yatsuki's back, just behind his heart. The civilian henge T had been using faded away, as did the clone lying in the street. Both Yugito and Yatsuki froze. T licked his lips nervously while his wide, bloodshot eyes darted around the now mostly empty street. "You have to let me go," he said desperately. "You don't understand." Yatsuki twisted abruptly, throwing a haymaker at Tango's head and attempting to dislodge his hand. He lost power halfway through the impromptu attack and stumbled sideways, gasping. A wet spot soaked through the front of his uniform as blood poured down his front. He gasped again, hand fluttering up as though to touch the stain, but a moment later the limb fell limply to his side. Yatsuki dropped to his knees, then collapsed face first onto the dusty pavement. On his back a hole was visible, just like the one on Jay, and liters of blood poured out of it in rhythmic spurts. Karui yelled something from a distance, but Yugito couldn't hear it over the pounding roar filling her ears. She didn't remember reaching for her tailed beast's chakra, but suddenly it was there, setting her veins on fire, pulsing in time to her heartbeat, and throwing all of her senses into sharp relief. Yugito raced across the distance between her and the fleeing T and smashed her first, claws bared, into his back. She retracted her nails and lashed out with her leg, catching him on his side with enough force that his form blurred like a baseball hit by a bat and sent him plowing into a building. The bricks around T shattered and indented, and with an ominous crack the balcony above came rumbling down, showering him with metal poles and clay tiles. Yugito stalked forward through the billowing dust, looking for any sign of movement even though she was sure she had knocked him unconscious. A thick cloak of Matabi's chakra covered her. It tickled at her skin, vibrating like a cat's purr. The familiar sensation felt calming, but Yugito clung tightly onto her rage, unwilling to give it up just yet, and instead settling into a cold, clear fury. Sounds of the world around her slowly returned, like water seeping into dry ground. Karui yelled expletives while Omoi spoke rapidly. The civilians had long since cleared out, having developed an acute danger sense from living in a hidden village, but shinobi drawn by the skirmish were starting to gather and ask questions. Yugito said, pointing to the nearest Chunin and then gesturing toward where T lay. "Contain him." She turned sharply on her heel and used an extra pulse of chakra to flash over to her teammate's side. Karui burned white-hot with anger and Omoi appeared particularly grim. Yugito kneeled down near Yatsuki, but didn't bother to check for vitals. What seemed like a cart's worth of blood had poured out onto the street and slowly flowed downhill. Yugito's stomach flipped at the sight, but she barely felt it through Matabi's chakra. "I'm sorry," Omoi said. "For what?" Yugito asked, voice flat and distant. Omoi just shook his head. There was a loud thump as Killer B landed in the middle of the street. He looked around briefly, eyebrows alternatively raising and lowering as he took in the scene. "Yugito-chan, I thought drama was supposed to be kept out of the village. This place looks like it could be used for horror movie footage," he said with a laugh. Yugito-sama?" another voice said tentatively. The kunoichi glanced over her shoulder and watched the approach of the Chunin she had handed tea over to. The trader's body had been moved out into the street and several other shinobi stood around him. "Why is he not bound?" Yugito questioned. "Ah, he's dead, ma'am." The muscles in Yugito's jaw clenched as she frowned fiercely past the Chunin. She felt Matabi's chakra fade away, but paid it no mind. "What killed him?" she asked. "You cut an artery, ma'am. He bled out," the Chunin said. Yugito's eyes narrowed. She was sure she hadn't hit anything major. She had specifically aimed for non-vital spots to make sure he could be brought in alive for questioning. "Dare I ask what happened?" B rumbled. Your anger looks heightened. Yugito looked at the Chunin and he backed away, returning to T's body. Once she was sure he had moved out of earshot for any classified information, she said, "Special John and T killed John and J, then tried to cover it up. When I confronted him, he attacked. He attempted to use Yatsuki as a hostage and killed him when he resisted." Yugito looked back at T's corpse and frowned again. "He died, apparently, though I am sure I did not use lethal force." B shrugged. "You were pissed off over the death of Comrade, and using the Nibi's chakra meant his fate was ironclad," he said. "It's not surprising that you used more force than you meant to, yeah. We cannot question him now," Yugito said. "The past is the past," B said. Ignoring the annoyed look on Yugito's face, he clapped a large hand on her shoulder and pulled her into his side. "Let's just report to A before you get downcast." Yugito automatically relaxed against B, then caught herself and stiffened. She carefully extricated herself from his embrace. "Thank you," she said. She quietly pulled Omoi and Karui away from their teammate's body, gave them busy work to do to keep their minds occupied, and prepared to leave herself. While she readied the lightning step technique, she glanced back at T's body one last time, only to find that it had already been moved, leaving only bloodstains behind. Yugito's stomach flipped again as her chakra pulled her away from the scene. She really didn't like blood. 8 a.m., February 6, 3:12 TE. Hidden Leaf Village's northern gate. Naruto's first mission out of the village came in the beginning of spring, just before the cherry blossoms started to bloom. Hitaki told nothing of the mission beforehand, only to meet him near the northern gate and pack for a week's worth of travel. Naruto had never been outside the village walls before, so to say that he was excited would be an understatement. Visions of towering cities, expanses of desert, ice caps, and jungles were flickering through his mind. He'd snuck into the movie theater a couple of times before and seen such places on the big screen, but with all his training these days he barely had enough time and energy to drag himself to the ramen stand, let alone do something fun. And of course, an actual vacation was completely out of the question. Naruto arrived at the gates early in the morning with a pack strapped to his back. His pockets were filled to the brim with weapons and he had enough food to make a chef jealous. He had made sure to completely seal his apartment before he left too. If anyone tried to break in they would be found dead the next day, and with Naruto far enough away to escape any blame. There was no one else at the gate other than the two Chunin stationed there, and thankfully Naruto recognized neither as one of his prank victims. So he took a seat on an empty stool next to them and dropped his pack onto the ground. One of the Chunin, a young man who was wearing his forehead protector like a bandana and had his hair flattened over his right eye, spared Naruto a glance. "Mission out of the village?" he asked. Naruto shrugged and leaned back against the wall. "Yeah, I'm just waiting for my sensei," he said. He glanced at the clock and saw that it was already after 7, the designated meeting time. "He'll probably be late." The Chunin nodded and went back to whatever he'd been doing, which happened to be balancing a kunai by its point on his finger. Naruto frowned at the sight, thinking that the weight of the kunai should prevent that from working, at least not without cutting him. He must have seen Naruto's look, because he flashed the boy a grin and then tossed him the kunai. "It's a chakra exercise," the Chunin explained. "Have you learned tree walking yet?" "Yeah, this is kind of like that, except you're just channeling chakra into a small point on your finger. You don't want to make the kunai stick, because it would probably cut you. Instead, you want just enough to push the metal away from your skin while still pulling down enough that it stays in place." That sounded a lot like a controlled version of water walking to Naruto. He nearly jerked his hand away when the Chunin grabbed his wrist, but months of fighting with Hitaki in close quarters had made Naruto a lot less jumpy around other people. So instead of ripping his arm away, he just stilled while the man took the kunai by its ring and held it above his hand. Naruto pointed his index finger up just like the Chunin had, so that it was right below the tip of the metal. "Channel your chakra so that it makes a thin thread only from the point of your finger. Use as small of an amount as you can," the Chunin instructed. Naruto narrowed his eyes at the kunai and did as the Chunin said. It occurred to him that the man never actually asked if he wanted to learn, but his desire to improve at pretty much anything far outweighed feeling miffed at someone telling him what to do. Naruto channeled chakra as he'd been told, using the smallest amount that he could, which for him was still a fair amount, but certainly buckets less than it had been a few months ago. The kunai bobbed upward as his chakra pushed against it. The Chunin slowly released the kunai. It shook for a moment, then promptly fell over and clattered to the ground. Naruto grimaced, but the Chunin just grinned and handed him the kunai again. He spent the next half-hour attempting, and failing miserably, to balance the kunai using his chakra. The two Chunin watched him with half an eye, clearly amused by his utter lack of control over his chakra. By the time Hitaki got there, Naruto was scowling and more than ready to stab something or someone with the kunai. But Hitaki wasn't alone. He was dumbfounded to watch him walk up to the gate leading a caravan consisting of 2 large wagons, a couple noblemen on horseback, and an entire contingency of samurai guards. While he gaped at the sight, Hitaki cheerfully walked up to the booth and handed over a stack of paperwork and IDs. "The hell?" Naruto hissed at his sensei. "Protection mission," Hitaki replied. "What, are the samurai just actors dressed up for show?" Naruto questioned as he eyed the swords they were all carrying. "Why the hell are they hiring a genin?" Hitaki gave him a look he couldn't quite decipher. "You were requested specifically, actually." While Naruto gaped, he continued on with a wave of his hand, "And besides, it's always good to have a few guards in the shadows. They're not expecting any trouble as far as I can see though. They sure as fuck look like they're expecting a damn invasion," Naruto muttered. He wondered if he had been requested because of the 9 tails. And if so, was that a good or a bad thing? "Behave yourself, Naruto," Hitaki said coolly. He accepted the paperwork back from the Chunin guards with a nod. It always ends messily when a shinobi gets mixed up in politics. "Politics? How is this?" Naruto cut himself short when one of the noblemen pulled his horse up next to them. Or rather he tried to. As soon as he got close the horse pulled away, prancing nervously from foot to foot. Naruto couldn't quite repress a grin when the whites of its eyes began to show as its eyes rolled wildly in its head. Animals could never stand to be anywhere near him. It was like they could sense that his existence was unnatural. "Bloody beast," the nobleman muttered as he pulled sharply on the reins. "Well, Shinobi-san, what is the hold up?" Naruto frowned up at him, thinking that he looked familiar, but he couldn't remember where he'd seen him before. Maybe the man was famous or something. Hitaki bowed his head slightly and then turned to his student. "You will be riding in the back of the first wagon with the client. Do not leave his side for any reason, do you understand me?" When Naruto nodded he continued, "Your primary objective is to protect him. If we're attacked, don't engage the enemy, just get him out of the area immediately." Standing straight, Naruto replied with a, "Yes sir," and then made his way into the caravan. The back of the first wagon was covered by a thick, soft covering. It reminded him of the tiger who was still underneath that deck. He had been feeding it on and off for the past few weeks, stealing meat when he could, because he sure as hell didn't have the money to pay for it. Despite the time and money he'd been putting into it, the summoned animal had hardly said another word to him other a quiet, "Thank you," once, and hardly looked any better than when he'd first found it. It took Naruto's eyes a second to adjust to the dimness of the wagon's interior. There were chakra lights lining the thick, dark wooden walls and it was larger than he expected. Hitaki probably could have stood up inside with only minimal stooping. At the front of the wagon, sitting on a bench that was lined with dark velvet, was a young nobleman just a handful of years older than him. Naruto stared at him for a moment, something about his appearance tickling at the back of his mind. Had he pickpocketed him before? Naruto realized with a start. The teenager smiled sheepishly. Takagi Akihito. He delivered a letter to him for his first mission. But if he was the client then that meant, oh fuck, he was supposed to protect the daimyo's nephew? If anything happened to him Naruto would be lucky not to be carted off to the capital and publicly executed. Or could the daimyo do that? Hell if Naruto knew where his power ended and the Hokages began. Either way this was very not good. "My apologies for the surprise," Takagi said, blissfully unaware of the shinobi's predicament. "I would have warned you, but I had no way of contacting you." For the first time in a long while, Naruto found himself speechless. All he could think was that when he failed they were going to try to decapitate him and then they'd all find out that he couldn't die and then they'd lock him up and… Takagi gestured to the bench across from Naruto. Between them was a table that was bolted to the floor. "Please, take a seat," he said. The wagon jerked forward suddenly and Naruto instinctively used his chakra to stick to the floorboards so that he didn't go toppling backward. He'd never been in a wagon or other moving vehicle before. It was a distinctly odd and unsettling feeling, knowing that he was moving without actually moving. He sat down heavily in the chair, still using chakra to stick to it out of fear that he'd fall out. A silence fell between them as the caravan moved along. Takagi, dressed in his unwrinkled, expensive-looking yukata, looked distinctly warm and uncomfortable in the stuffy wagon, but he didn't complain. Conversely, sitting there in his dirt-stained orange and black shinobi outfit and being surrounded by opulence made Naruto feel just as poor as he really was. "I need your help," Takagi suddenly blurted out. "Huh?" was all Naruto could think to say. Takagi reddened faintly, but looked determined. "I requested you for this mission because I need your help with something. You are the only shinobi I have met in the Hidden Leaf Village and thereby one of the only people who I know for sure does not answer to my guardian," he said. Oh god, Hitaki was right about the politics thing. What was Takagi going to ask, if Naruto could assassinate his guardian? When he didn't reply immediately, Takagi hesitated, but looked undeterred. He fumbled while taking out a folded piece of paper from within his yukata, then spread it out across the table. It turned out to be a detailed map of Fire Country. Takagi tapped a road on it that ran north from Hidden Leaf Village and said, "This is the route we're taking." He drew his finger up along it, tracing it to a star on the map that was labeled Keisha, Fire Country's capital city, and the daimyo's seat of power. Takagi paid little attention to it, however, and instead pointed to a spot on the map that was probably a few days' travel north of the city, not too far from the road they would be taking. "And that would be?" Naruto prompted. The young nobleman flashed an excited smile. "I have on good authority that that is an area where some new ruins have been discovered. They have been dated as being several hundred years old, back to before the beginning of the shinobi era," he said, nearly breathless. "It is private land, so almost no one has looked into it yet. Can you just imagine it? There could be buildings there that have stood untouched for centuries, just waiting to be uncovered." Buildings? Naruto thought, bewildered. This was about some old buildings? "And what does this have to do with me?" he asked cautiously. "My guardian would never let me go exploring like that. He would rather I remain locked up in a wing of the Lotus Palace instead, so if I asked one of the guards to go with me he would react adversely. And if I asked Nama-san, my uncle would surely hear of it. I am not foolish enough to try to go on my own either, so that leaves the only option of hiring an outside guard to go with me," Takagi said. Naruto leaned back in his seat and appraised Takagi thoughtfully. While a very large part of him was still thinking, "This is not going to end well," he couldn't deny his own curiosity. And the mere thought of all the money he could get if Takagi continued to hire him for missions made him drool. He might be able to afford soundproofing for his ceiling and get a good night's sleep in his own bed for once. "Who's Nama?" Naruto asked. "Ah, one of my uncle's 12 guardian shinobi. He usually guards me while I'm out of Keisha, but he went ahead of us this time since I hired you two as an escort." Naruto nodded slowly, though he felt like that wasn't the whole story. He had heard of the guardians in the academy and knew that they were all supposed to be exceptional shinobi. Would one of them really just leave like that because Takagi asked? "So what exactly do you want me to do?" Naruto questioned. Takagi's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Naruto probably wouldn't have noticed had he not spent years reading body language. It was the best way to tell if a shopkeeper was on to him and was about to throw him out, or if the person he was about to target for a prank was already aware of his presence. "I just need you to come with me," the teenager said. "On the 4th day of the trip we will be stopping for the night near to where the ruins were found. After we have settled in for the night you will help me sneak away from camp. We will look around a bit, then come back." It sounded simple enough to Naruto, but Takagi's eyes were gleaming with excitement, as though it was going to be a grand adventure. Naruto supposed the noble had never been outside his gilded cage before. Living like that would drive the genin insane. What was life without the occasional paint prank or death-defying fall? Naruto nodded reluctantly and tried to pretend that the blinding smile Takagi sent him wasn't infectious. Takagi started chatting on about older civilizations, history, buildings and other things that Naruto didn't have the first clue about. He rather reminded Naruto of an overly enthusiastic chipmunk. When he'd exhausted himself at last, Takagi stood up, somehow managing to keep his balance on the moving wagon without chakra, and went over to one of the chests that was in the very front of the wagon. He pulled out a polished wooden board and a box and set them down on the table. Would you like to play shogi? He asked eagerly. It'll be a great way to pass the time. I don't really know how to play. Naruto had seen it played before, but he'd never paid much attention to board games, even as a kid. They were just those expensive and too bulky to shoplift things that other kids had. Takagi only looked all the more excited. I can teach you then. Naruto watched curiously as he set up the wooden board with smooth wedge-shaped marble tiles that had kanji characters carved into their surface and began to explain the rules. Part of it went over Naruto's head at first, but he figured it was kind of like a spar in that he had a certain set of skills to use against his opponent. The wagon rolled on as they started to play. Naruto could hear faint voices outside and the clop of the horse's hooves, accented by the occasional clink from the shogi pieces. 11:30 p.m., February 10, 3:12 TE. Roadside camp, midway between Hidden Leaf Village and Keisha. When someone tapped Naruto on the shoulder in the middle of the night, he was instantly awake and on his feet, throwing off the person who had awakened him. It took him a brief second to see Akihito's faded outline toppling backward, then another second to grab his collar and haul him back to his feet. What the F? Naruto managed to say before Takagi shushed him. The guards are just sitting around the fire now, he whispered urgently. Do you know where the other shinobi is? Hitaki-sensei? Naruto mumbled. He shook his head to clear out the last vestiges of sleep. Pushing back the curtain on the back of the wagon just enough to see outside, Naruto cast an eye around the camp that had been made between the two wagons and saw a sea of sleeping bags and snoring samurai. After a second he caught a flash of silver hair, and when he turned his head he found Hitaki sitting up against the other wagon with Takauji's guardian, Sasaki, Naruto thought his name was, next to him. Naruto pulled back into the wagon and said, I think I have an idea. Just start walking into the woods and don't look back, I'll be right behind you. And try not to look like you're sneaking away to do nefarious things, yeah? Takagi stifled a laugh and nodded. With surprising calmness he stepped out the back of the wagon and turned to walk into the woods. As Naruto followed him he saw that while none of the samurai had noticed, Hitaki turned his head to them. Bathroom, Naruto mouthed to him, and Hitaki nodded and looked away. As he quickly followed Takagi into the darkness, Naruto felt a twinge of guilt that he mercilessly squashed beneath years of bitterness and persecution. He needed money to survive, and to get money he would do what he had to, and right now that meant helping the daimyo's nephew have his little adventure. As they left the light of the campfire, Naruto was surprised to see how quickly and silently Takagi moved. He wondered if the teen had much experience sneaking around. Maybe he was really an enemy shinobi in disguise and Naruto was a part of a large conspiracy plot to assassinate the daimyo? The thought nearly made him laugh aloud. Quiet or not, Takagi wouldn't have the first clue of what to do with a kunai. Suddenly, Naruto noticed that they weren't just meandering through the woods, but following a faint path. Takagi stopped abruptly and crouched down and brushed his fingers across a stone. With a start Naruto realized that it was square in shape, and clearly man-made. As they continued along, the stones became more frequent. The path had once been paved, but was now mostly worn away or buried. It must have been very old, older even than the dried-up, green hunk of food in the back of one of Naruto's cabinets, which he was sure had been there for a few centuries at least. Naruto was aware that pre-shinobi-era ruins were occasionally found in Fire Country, but it wasn't something he'd ever paid much attention to. Old buildings, even ones that were said to be more than hundreds of years old, just didn't concern him. How could they help him on his path to becoming a stronger shinobi? But thinking that there were non-food items out there that were hundreds of years older than him. It was a bit intimidating to realize that the world was so much bigger than him. In the academy they were taught almost solely about the history of Hidden Leaf Village. He didn't even know how the pre-shinobi-era civilizations had fallen. Takagi took another step forward and then suddenly the ground gave way beneath him and he was gone. For a moment Naruto froze, staring at the empty path. His heart began to jump around in his chest like a cat trapped in a paper bag and he scrambled forward to the edge of the hole where the earth had fallen in beneath Takauji's weight. Dirt continued to fall loose and drop into the hole, but the ground held strong beneath his feet. Shit, Naruto swore aloud. Takagi, can you hear me? A groan sounded from below, closer than Naruto expected. I'm fine, Takagi said. The ground is pretty soft. Just a second. Naruto could hear the shifting of cloth as he fumbled for something, and then suddenly the light from a flashlight was shining on his face. Akihito cast it around and Naruto could see that the teen was only just over 15 feet below. "Come down here," Takagi said, suddenly excited again as he ran out of view. "There's a tunnel." Naruto knew there was no way for this not to end in disaster. He growled at his own stupidity for going along with something like this. All the money in the world wasn't worth the possibility of getting arrested for killing the daimyo's nephew. And now the only way to get that fool out of there was to go down into a half-collapsed tunnel himself? Standing on the edge of the hole with his heart still pounding wildly in his chest, Naruto could think of nothing other than how the tunnel would collapse on his head and he'd be buried eternally in the earth, breathing in dirt and unable to move. He didn't even like going into basements, and now he had to go down there. Naruto took a deep breath and closed his eyes tightly. He was a shinobi, damn it. He had trampled over every shinobi, civilian, and stingy store owner trying to get in his way, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let some goddamned tunnel stop him. With his eyes still screwed closed, he braced his legs and jumped down into the hole. As Takagi had said, the ground was soft and slightly springy. One at a time, Naruto slowly opened his eyes. The tunnel stretched forward in front of him, and his breath caught in his throat at the sight. It was like a giant maw opening up before his, ready to swallow him whole. Naruto tried to focus solely on the light of Takagi's flashlight further in the distance and quickly made his way toward him. He placed a hand on the noble's shoulder, more than ready to drag both of them out of there as fast as possible. Before Naruto could say a word, however, Takagi pointed toward the wall of the tunnel and said, "There's something metal in it." Naruto frowned, but did see the piece of silver metal that was shimmering through the dirt. With a sigh, he brushed away the dirt around it, hoping that whatever it was would satisfy Akihito's inquisitiveness. More dirt fell away, but it only revealed more metal, flat beneath his hand. Naruto's frown deepened and he took out a kunai, using it to scrape away more dirt and reveal more metal. "It's a wall," Takagi said suddenly. "Look." He flashed the light across the circumference of the tunnel and Naruto realized with a start that it was unnaturally square. Even the ceiling looked flat, despite the dirt hanging from it. "You think it's made of metal?" Naruto asked as he crossed over to the other wall. He scrapped at it as well, and found metal beneath the dirt again. He tried the same with the ground, but found only dirt even when he shoved his kunai in up to the hilt. Takagi looked around thoughtfully. So it would seem. But why cover the metal up with dirt? He started walking forward again. Further into the tunnel? Really? Naruto closed his eyes again briefly. He just wanted to get out of there, not find out why there was a square, metal, dirt-covered tunnel built underground. A surprised cry rang out through the tunnel and his eyes instantly shot open. In half a second Naruto crossed the distance between him and Takagi and reached out to grab him. Naruto stopped short when he saw that Takagi was standing, unharmed, in front of a clean metal wall that was apparently the end of the tunnel. There was a tall door set into it with some sort of a metal wheel attached. The metal was worn and covered in rust, but Akihito was staring at it with awe. "The hell?" Naruto muttered. Dashing forward, Takagi grabbed the wheel and tried to turn it. It squeaked and moved just a fraction of an inch while he grunted with the effort, awkwardly trying to hold the flashlight at the same time. A moment later he stopped and turned to Naruto, an embarrassed flush on his face. Would you mind?" Naruto sighed, but nodded and moved forward to take his place. The wheel was definitely stuck, and it took him digging his heels into the ground, channeling chakra into his hands to get a good grip, and pulling with all his strength to get it to haltingly turn. Abruptly it loosened completely and started turning with ease, nearly making Naruto stumble. Then the wheel stopped and a rather ominous, heavy click echoed through the tunnel. 12 a.m., February 11, 3:12 TE. Unknown underground location, midway between Hidden Leaf Village and Keisha. The door started to open on its own. Naruto warily stepped backward to stand alongside Takagi, slipping another kunai into one hand and palming a couple of shuriken in the other. Nothing jumped out at them, as he'd half expected, but a wave of sickeningly sweet, sterile-smelling air hit Naruto like a wave. It reminded him instantly of the air inside the hospital. He had never been there as a patient, but he'd snuck in a few times to get bedsheets and pillows. They had so many that they'd never miss them. Takagi gagged at the concentrated smell while Naruto wrinkled his nose, but thankfully its strength faded pretty quickly. A mechanical buzzing sounded from above, and then one by one a series of long tube-like lights began to turn on inside the vault. The light revealed a clean corridor with a white tiled floor and the same smooth metal walls that were in the tunnel, sans dirt. It bisected at a T-junction about 20 feet ahead and continued out of sight. Takagi breathed out sharply, a look of awe lighting up his face. "It's clean," he commented in wonder as he leaned forward. "No dirt or dust. And the air should be stale after being locked up so tightly for a long period of time. There must be some kind of air recycling system and a generator for the electricity. What is this? Some kind of super secret underground lab? Are freakin' zombies going to pop out and try to eat us alive?" Naruto grumbled. "Well, as far as I know there aren't any hidden Leaf Village bases in the area, but this couldn't have been sealed for very long." "I'm not so sure about that," Takagi said. Naruto made a small sound in the back of his throat as Takagi took a step into the corridor. Craning his neck back to look up at the lights, he continued, "I remember learning about those when my tutor taught me about how electricity works. They're fluorescent bulbs, which haven't been used in centuries now." Naruto wasn't even aware that electricity had been around for that long. Suddenly his academy education seemed severely lacking. "We should go back," he said. "There really could be zombies or some type of enemy in there. And look at these hinges." Takagi continued obliviously, pointing to something behind the door and not hearing Naruto's protests. Heaving a sigh, Naruto stepped into the corridor. The door itself was a behemoth, more than 2 feet thick, about 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, and made of solid metal. What Takagi was pointing to were 2 weird metal arms that were holding the door open. Naruto couldn't begin to guess how such tiny things had moved such a large door, and from the excited look on the nobleman's face, similar thoughts were running through his head. "I have never seen anything like this in the basic engineering I was taught," he said as he ran a hand along the smooth metal. "Can you imagine the applications for something like this? It is more than just a pulley system. I know this is utterly exciting and all, but it's still extremely dangerous. Part of the tunnel has already collapsed, so who says the rest won't come down around our heads as well?" "Seriously, let's go," Naruto urged. He'd already been underground for longer than his nerves could stand and was staunchly ignoring how sweaty and shaky his hands were getting. Takagi turned his pleading eyes on Naruto. It was an odd sight, considering that he was almost a full foot and a half taller than the genin. "Come on, we will just take a quick look, I promise. This is an incredible find and we have already come all this way. Would it not be disappointing if we came away empty-handed? It looks to me like you've already found more than enough to occupy you," Naruto grumbled. He glanced up at the lights again. Were they really something from a bygone era? Had this place been sealed for centuries? What if Takagi was right, and they'd discovered something that no one had stepped foot into in living memory? God, just the thought of the amount of money that could be made off something like that made him shiver with glee. "Fine," Naruto said at last. "We'll take a quick look around, but just a quick look." And he would gladly prove that something as inconsequential as a tunnel had no power over him. He would be down here as long as he wanted to be, without feeling like his chest was being squeezed by a giant hand. Naruto took another step into the vault. The bright lights helped chase away the feeling that the walls were closing in on him a bit. No traps sprung as he continued forward, and no zombies jumped out. When Takagi started to follow him, however, Naruto waved him back. "Stay near the door for now, until I make sure it's clear," Naruto ordered. "If it starts to close or anything happens, go back to Hitaki Kakashi." Takagi looked as though he wanted to protest, but ultimately he just nodded. "As soon as you say it is safe, I will follow," he agreed. As Naruto turned back to the end of the hall, he saw the teen pull out a pad of paper and a pencil. Where did he keep all that stuff anyway? And sit down to begin sketching out the metal arms on the back of the door. Naruto left him to it and continued his trek. He paused at the T-junction. To his right was a regular pair of double doors, but the passage on the left ended about a dozen paces away at what looked like an elevator door. There was a panel on the wall next to it with some kind of screen that was covered in symbols Naruto had never seen before. He moved closer to it, frowning. He assumed it was a code of some kind, or maybe an older language. He'd have to ask Takagi when he took a look. Turning away from the elevator for the moment, Naruto went down to the right wing of the hall and stopped in front of the double doors. They pushed open easily enough. The room behind those doors? Naruto didn't have the slightest clue what it was for. His first thought was that it was an office of some kind, because the floor was carpeted and there was a large desk against the far wall. In front of that desk, however, were about a dozen chairs that were arranged against the walls like it was a waiting room. The upper part of the wall to his right was covered in cabinets, and the wall to his left had only a single door set into it that had no obvious handle. Mounted next to it was another small device that had numbers on little squares, like a keypad. Still frowning, Naruto walked around the chairs and approached the desk. There were a couple small yellowing stacks of papers on it, and when he picked one up he found that they were covered in the same strange symbols as the screen next to the elevator. A quick sweep around the room revealed no traps or hidden exits. With his head down, Naruto left the room and headed back to the entrance where Takagi was just finishing up his sketch. It was surprisingly good and was covered in tiny notes and measurements. It reminded Naruto of some of the technical drawings that had been in his academy textbooks. "All clear," Naruto said after a moment. Takagi was startled and dropped his pencil. "Oh, right," he said as he quickly jumped to his feet. "Did you find anything?" "Not sure, you'll have to take a look." They headed back to the office-like room and Takagi took a look around. He was fascinated by all of it, staring at the chairs and the papers and everything he could get his hands on like it was stuff he'd never seen before. While he began to dig through the drawers of the desk, Naruto wandered over to the device next to the sealed door. After a second of hesitation he pressed one of the numbers, then jumped and looked around wildly when it beeped. For a moment his heart pounded in his chest, but no one came running and no alarm sounded. He cautiously pressed another number and got the same electronic beep. "It looks like some kind of electronic lock," Takagi said as he came up behind the younger boy. "With numbers?" Naruto replied, bewildered. Takagi leaned closer and squinted at it. "It could be some kind of combination lock. It is rather ingenious, really, if it works. Most physical locks can be broken with the right amount of brute force. But this? We do not even have the first clue about how it works." As he looked it over, Naruto noticed that Takagi was holding something. "What's that?" he asked, pointing it out. Takagi grinned and held it up. It was thin and black, made of either metal or plastic, Naruto couldn't tell. "I found it in one of the drawers." "What the hell is that?" Naruto questioned, squinting at it. "I do not know." Takagi flipped it around, looking at it from every angle. It was about the size of his hand and less than half an inch thick. One side of it was completely smooth like hard plastic while the other was made of a different, slightly rougher material. Takagi turned it around again, then suddenly yelped in surprise and dropped it when the smooth side lit up. "Shit!" Naruto reached for his weapon pouch, but just as quickly as he dropped it, Takagi snatched the thing up again, his face glowing with excitement. "It is a screen," he said. "Look." Naruto cautiously edged forward. "It's tiny. How could that be a screen? And for what?" But he could see what Takagi meant. There were things visible on it now. Shapes and colors and more of that odd writing, but still nothing that Naruto could make heads or tails of. He was starting to get really annoyed with being confused all the time. Takagi pressed the screen again, and the images on it shifted and changed. He continued pressing things, his excitement growing with each passing second. "What does it do?" Naruto asked dubiously. "I have no idea," Takagi replied cheerfully. "But it is incredible. Have you ever seen anything like this before?" "I can't say I have," Naruto said dryly. "But I still say we need to go. We have to get back before anyone notices you're missing, you know." Takagi wilted under his words like a kid who'd just had their toy taken away, and indeed, he held the weird screen thingy tighter as though he feared that Naruto would take it away. "Fine," Takagi said after a second. "But let me finish looking around this desk first. And we have to come back here when we have a chance." "Yeah," Naruto agreed as he took another look around the room. His gaze momentarily drifted toward the elevator at the other end of the hall, wondering where it led. Just how deep did these tunnels go? After a little more urging, or rather grabbing the back of Takagi's collar and dragging him away from the room, they finally left the sterile corridors. Naruto paused for a moment at the massive door that led to the dirt-covered tunnels. The hairs on his arms stood on end as he ran a finger down the side of the doorway, noting the small, dark rings that went down it. They were about 1.5 inches across, with a foot of vertical space between each one. "Uzumaki-san?" Takagi questioned, glancing back at him. I can feel chakra coming from these things, Naruto said, surprise coloring his voice. I think the door is locked with chakra. But something like that would need a constant chakra source. He glanced back into the corridor as he spoke and felt a shiver run down his spine that had absolutely nothing to do with his reaction to enclosed spaces. 3 p.m., February 11, 3:12 TE. Hidden Cloud Village. If you stare any harder at that glass, it's likely to shatter, Karui said with a smirk. Yugito jerked her head up as her concentration broke. Ah, she shook her head. Are you alright, Yugito-sama? Omoi asked. Yes, Yugito said. She glanced around her at team. The three of them were seated in a small restaurant, sharing a meal as was their post-mission tradition. None of them looked at open seat where Yatsuki would have sat. I was just thinking. I feel as though I missed something. Missed something? Karui questioned with a frown. Her eyes slid to Yatsuki's seat for a second, then darted away. Yugito's eyes narrowed and her gaze bored into the table again. It all fell into place too easily. Karui and Omoi shared a look. Yugito-sama. Yugito stood abruptly. Her subordinates shared one more glance before they scrambled out of their seats. The bill, Omoi said. Just pay it. Karui snapped, waving a hand at him without looking back. Omoi huffed, but quickly pulled out his wallet while the rest of his team stepped out of the restaurant. He caught up with them a minute later, just as Yugito turned a corner and leapt up onto the nearest roof. Her team stayed quiet as they ran through Hidden Cloud Village. Yugito barely noticed, almost all of her attention focused inward as her mind raced, bringing up and discarding theory after theory. She used lightning step to quickly move from compound to compound. Karui and Omoi tensed when they landed on the roof of a building next to the street where Yatsuki had died. Yugito paused for only a second before leaping across the street to Jay's apartment building. She stuck to the side of the building with chakra for a moment, then pulled herself into Jay's apartment through his still open balcony. What is it, Yugito-sama? Omoi asked, glancing around the room with narrowed eyes. Yugito didn't bother to answer just yet. She strode out of the apartment and stopped 2 doors down. Raising her fist, she knocked sharply on the wood. Her team shifted uncomfortably behind her. No one answered. Yugito knocked again and waited another 30 seconds. When there still was no response, she placed her hand on the door and inserted a small chakra string into the doorknob. A moment later the lock clicked open. The door swung open to an empty apartment, devoid of any furniture. Karui, contact the building manager and find out who last rented this apartment, Yugito said. The red-haired kunoichi hesitated, opening her mouth to argue, but changed her mind when Yugito glanced back. Instead she nodded and vanished with a faint crackle. Who used to live here? Omoi asked. He followed Yugito into the apartment, but neither of them found anything of interest. There wasn't even any dust. Do a search for chakra impression, Yugito said. Once he'd nodded and settled down in the middle of the apartment, she said, the primary reason I uncovered T's treason was because a civilian woman inquired about what happened and mentioned in passing that T and J had been friends. A suspicious connection, as T had shown no surprise or sadness at J's death. You don't think she was a civilian woman, Omoi murmured as he closed his eyes and began to concentrate. Something about the entire encounter felt off to me, Yugito agreed. At first I believed grief was coloring my memory of the incident, but... She shook her head. I do not believe in coincidences. The civilian woman was there for a reason. She intentionally pointed out the connection between T and J, revealing T's treachery. If such a connection even existed in the first place. Yugito frowned and stared out the window and into the gray clouds in the distance. There were a number of theories she could come up with explaining what the woman's intentions were, but with her absence in this apartment now. None of those theories were good. The woman had revealed a traitor, yes, but... Some dark intuition niggled at the back of Yugito's mind. She didn't like this one bit. What if the woman been working with T and ratted him out so that she could get away? No, that didn't quite work. Why turn on T? And why risk getting him captured and interrogated, potentially revealing herself as well? Yugito glared at the window. No, something else was going on. Omoi opened his eyes. Only one person was in this room recently. Their chakra signature was small, either a skilled civilian, or a shinobi suppressing their chakra. They were here for only a few days and left about a week ago. Probably the same day as Jay's assassination. Yugito's gaze switched back to the open apartment door as Karui approached. The redhead was frowning heavily. The last tenant was an older woman who died of natural causes a month ago, Karui said. No one has lived here since then. What the hell is going on, Yugito-sama? That is what I would like to ask, Yugito murmured. Omoi, memorize the chakra signature you feel here. We need to find the woman who spoke to me. She may be the only lead we have so far. While Omoi nodded, Karui snorted and crossed her arms under her chest. And now we're back to hunting for traitors. Oh goody? Traitors from within the village or without, Yugito wondered. Traitors from within could be ferreted out eventually, or else would abandon the village and leave themselves. But if they had support from another village? Her frown deepened. The hidden villages had been at peace for too long. It wouldn't surprise her in the slightest if someone was making their move now, and would surprise her even less if it turned out to be those leaf bastards. This confirmed one other thing at least. Yugito knew she hadn't hit T hard enough to kill him. No, someone else was covering this up. 4 p.m., February 13, 3:12 TE. Outside Keisha. It took another 2 days to reach the capital. Takagi and Naruto spent most of that time in the wagon, discussing what they'd found. Well, he spent most of his time excitedly throwing out theories and exploring the device he'd found while Naruto listened and nodded at the right intervals. Sure, Naruto kind of found the entire thing fascinating too, but it was a bit hard to follow when Takagi went off on a fast-paced rant about engineering and the ramifications of new discoveries. Please don't tell anyone about this yet, Takagi begged. If word gets out now, the Historical Society will take over completely and we will probably never get another glimpse of it. I know you were supposed to report everything to your commanders, but… Please? It was distinctly odd to see a pleading expression on a nobleman's face, even a teenage nobleman. Naruto had always pictured nobles as being cold and snobbish, not like this. This doesn't affect the mission, so I don't strictly need to mention it. Naruto said slowly. Hitaki already suspected something, he was sure, but Naruto could deal with him when Hitaki finally approached him about it. Thank you, Takagi said, heaving a sigh of relief. Just then the wagon rolled to a stop. Takagi quickly hurried to the back of the wagon and peeked out the curtain. He said something that Naruto couldn't quite make out to one of the samurai guards, and then drew back inside. We have arrived at the gates. Would you like to take a look? I have heard that it is an inspiring sight to those who have never seen Keisha before, Takagi said. Why not? Naruto shrugged. They couldn't be any more ridiculous than Hidden Leaf Village's enormous walls. Naruto followed Takagi out of the wagon. The caravan had stopped outside of the city and was being checked over by a couple of guards. Naruto eyed them for a moment before turning to the city. His breath caught in his throat. Never mind Hidden Leaf Village's walls. Keisha's made them look like they were made of sticks. Keisha's walls were built from stone towers that loomed dozens of stories high into the sky like a giant's fingers. The roofing of the towers was made of shingles and he could faintly make out figures patrolling the tops of the walls. The height itself wasn't what caught Naruto's eye though. What made him gape openly were the murals that covered every visible inch of the city's walls. It was a dizzying array of dragons and phoenixes and tigers and every other manner of fantastic beast, running to and fro and spelling out legends. There was an army marching toward a river beneath one tower and a samurai presenting a ruler with his sword on another. Further along he saw a story about a princess flying on the back of a large raven over the image of a city much like Keisha. The paint was old. That much Naruto could tell instantly, even from a distance. It was cracked in several places and fading here and there, but the color still shone strong. He couldn't even begin to comprehend how long it must have taken to paint such a mural. The wall itself was hundreds of feet tall, and the city of Keisha was massive, home to several million people, so it had to be miles and miles long. Was it painted for its entire length, or just around the gates? Naruto opened his mouth and turned to Takagi to ask him, but the teen had moved over to his guardian and was discussing something with a guard. Naruto shook his head slowly and stared back up at the gates. He was beginning to feel as though he was in another world when outside of Hidden Leaf Village. Nothing was how he expected it to be. Everything was larger, grander, and older. Slowly pivoting on one foot he turned away from the mountainous walls and told himself that his heart was racing from excitement, not fear of this new, unknown world. 5 p.m., February 13, 3:12 TE. South District, Keisha. Keisha had not always been a mighty city, nor even the capital of Fire Country. Once, long ago during the Saichu era, it was not but a small fishing village built along the Okagawa River. With time, its prime location allowed it to flourish into a trading town, and then into a merchant's haven. By the beginning of the Suyoi era, known popularly as the Shinobi era, it was the largest city in Fire Country, home to over 1 million souls with hundreds of boats and thousands of traders passing through every day. When the Takagi daimyo rose to power in the Suyoi era, he moved the capital from Yasuragi to his home city of Keisha. Over the next 2 centuries the city continued to flourish and expand, becoming famed across the elemental nations as not only one of the most expansive trading ports in the world, but also a cultural center for art, architecture, and religion. More than 1,000 temples called Keisha their home, and the Lotus Palace and its 20-square-mile garden was considered a piece of art unto itself. Today Keisha boasted a population of 2.3 million citizens, second only to the city of Yamashi in Lightning Country, and stretched across both sides of the Okagawa River, covering more than 250 square miles of land. Or so Takagi Akihito told him. Frankly, Naruto's mind was spinning purely from the idea that there were 2 million people walking around him. Hidden Leaf Village, which he had always thought of as a very large city, had barely than 1/10 of that population. They had split from the wagons in favor of riding horses, and Naruto could see why now. The streets were filled with throngs of people, like a sea of colors and faces. Even with the samurai contingency around them making way, they were moving at a snail's pace. The horse beneath him was about ready to have a heart attack from fear, and Naruto wasn't far behind it. He'd never ridden on a horse or any sort of animal before, and it had taken more than just a little urging from Takagi and teasing from Hitaki before he dared to mount one. His hands were still clutching the pommel almost tightly enough to tear it off. He was sure that he was going to slide off at any second or that the wild beast beneath him would rear and bolt. Keisha is split into 5 districts, Takagi eagerly explained as they rode through the city. With a wave of his hand, he gestured to the buildings around them. They towered high over their heads, taller by far than the Hokage Tower or any other structure Naruto had ever seen. He felt dwarfed in their midst, and even the brightly colored sheets and clothing hanging from laundry lines over their heads couldn't detract from the suspicion that they were really a giant's fingers reaching down to scoop him up. "This is the Southern District," Takagi continued. "We are heading toward the Central District, where the Lotus Palace, my uncle's home, is and where most other nobles reside. Around us are also the Northern District, the Western District, and the Eastern District. Because the Okagawa River passes through Eastern District, it is well known for its docks and merchant quarter." A history lesson and a guided tour, just what Naruto wanted. Now he could die happy, knowing that rich, fat merchants had a home to call their own. Not that he could deny that Keisha was awe-inspiring. It was just more than a little overwhelming to a shinobi. An assassination attempt could come from any angle in this crowd, with no way to predict or prevent it. They turned a street corner and suddenly Naruto could see a massive 2-story tall red torii up ahead, marking the entrance to a temple. There were trees beyond it, hiding anything past the long stone steps leading upward, but what was really amazing was the massive stone statue, easily 400 or 500 feet tall, that was thrust up above the treetops. It was worn green with time, but the features of a bearded man were still clearly defined. "The great Izanagi statue," Takagi said with a smile. "One of Keisha's most recognizable landmarks, other than the wall itself." "That must have taken a while to make," Naruto commented faintly. He wondered if someone had used a jutsu to help craft it. They passed a lot of other temples, statues, and murals as they continued on into the heart of the city. Eventually they reached the tall white wall that separated Central District from the others. A swift glance told Naruto that it was patrolled at intervals by heavily armed guards. Once they were in the Central District they passed dozens upon dozens of lavish manors and castles, each with acres of gardens and well-tended land around them. It would be easy to forget they were still in the middle of a city, were it not for the massive buildings still towering around them in the distance. For better or for worse, it wasn't the Lotus Palace that they stopped at. A part of Naruto was burning with curiosity, wanting to know what such an exalted building looked like after all the treasures he had already seen today, but he was also pretty sure that he'd vomit if he saw any more wealth that was out of his reach. It was frustrating enough passing by so much without being able to get his hands on anything. Some of the merchandise he'd seen today would sell for high prices and leave. It turned out that Takagi lived in a small castle anyway. The complex was big enough to fit the entire Hyuga compound 3 times over, and probably the size of a small town. Despite how normal Naruto had found Takagi to be, he fit in easily with the opulence, looking relaxed and at home, which Naruto supposed was exactly what he was. As they stood in the courtyard that his entire apartment building could have fit in, a servant came and helped Naruto get down from the horse that by some miracle hadn't died or bucked him off yet. Teeth bared, Naruto shook off the man's hands and jumped down on his own. The horse immediately tried to prance away, and it took several other servants to calm it down. "You and your sensei are welcome to stay if you would like to," Takagi told him. He looked excited, and part of Naruto wondered if he'd ever had someone close to his age over before. "I'm afraid we must return as quickly as possible," Hitaki replied, suddenly behind Naruto. Takagi hesitated, then nodded. "I understand," he said. He bowed, and Naruto felt more than saw Hitaki tense in surprise. "I wish you a safe journey back, Shinobi-san. I thank you for your assistance." Naruto awkwardly returned a similar bow. Yeah, you too." Once Hitaki had exchanged pleasantries with Sasaki, they finally left the complex, this time mercifully on foot. "We'll stop to get something to eat and then head straight back to Hidden Leaf Village," Hitaki said. "With your current speed and endurance, we should be able to make it home in little over a day. And along the way you can tell me all about your little adventure in the woods with our client." Naruto winced at that. Of course Hitaki had noticed how long they were gone for, he always noticed everything. "He's fine, as you saw," Naruto protested. "He just asked to go for a walk and get away from the camp, and you told me to never leave his side during the mission, so I didn't. It's not like we were attacked, and you even said there was probably no danger for the mission. And if there had been bandits in the woods? Then I'd kick their asses. I can handle civilians any day of the week," Naruto retorted with a wide grin. "Such a hard-headed student you've got there, Kakashi-kun," a woman's voice said behind us. "Funny, I never pictured you as the sensei type." Naruto spun around as fast as he could, a kunai practically leaping into his hand as his heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't heard anyone sneaking up. Hitaki, however, wasn't the slightest bit alarmed. He casually turned, presenting the person behind them with his profile as he cocked his head in an arrogant sort of way. "Tu-chan," he greeted her nonchalantly. Tu was a kunoichi in her late 20s with short purple hair. She wore a sleeveless black shinobi jumpsuit with straw waraji sandals on her feet and bandages on her forearms. Tied around her waist was a bandana-like piece of cloth that had a circle on it, within which was the character for fire. Naruto could easily tell that Hitaki-sensei stared at that symbol more than the woman herself. "I was under the impression that you had left the Guardians," he said. The woman flicked some of her hair out of her eyes. "Then your intel is just as poor as I assumed," she said with a mocking sneer and a dark fire in her eyes. "Speaking of which, how is Asuma?" "He's doing well. I believe he's thinking of taking up a genin team of his own," Hitaki answered shortly. Tu scoffed and then turned her gaze on Naruto. Hitaki placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and Naruto nearly flinched because even if he was acting casual, it felt like Hitaki was about to rip his shoulder off. "This is Uzumaki Naruto, my genin." She stared at him, assumingly recognizing his name, and Naruto managed to retain his decorum for all of 2 seconds before he snapped, "What? Are you waiting for me to sprout fangs and go for your jugular? Because I guarantee we'll be standing here all night if that's the case, and I'm damn hungry." Tu released a short, bark-like laugh. "Well, he's got fire, I'll give you that much," she said. "You might want to keep him on a shorter leash though. His presence is already stirring up all sorts of unwanted interest." While Naruto was left blinking in confusion and wondering what the hell that was supposed to mean, Hitaki hummed noncommittally. "I'll keep your warning in mind," he replied, though his blasé tone said the opposite. "If there's nothing else." Tu sneered again. With a quiet crack that sounded like a strike of lightning, she disappeared. "Time to go, Naruto-kun," Hitaki said. 11 p.m., February 13, 3:12 TE. Lotus Palace, Keisha. Tu's eyes narrowed when Kazuma walked past the courtyard. Another shinobi followed him a moment later. She used Shunshin to flash up to the edge of a low rooftop and crouched in the shadows made by the second floor. Overhead the sun started to dip below the wall, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The two shinobi disappeared into another doorway, but two followed them overhead using chakra to sharpen her hearing. Kazuma had always had heavy footsteps for a shinobi, and she followed their sound now. Kazuma stopped and two froze. There was no more sound from below, even though she was sure she hadn't been caught. With light steps, she picked her way across the roof to the edge of the building. She flipped down onto the side of the building and stuck to the wall while simultaneously applying a basic genjutsu that allowed her to blend further into the shadows. There were no windows nearby and still no sounds from inside, but two was still sure that this was where Kazuma had gone. The room they'd entered likely had privacy seals on it to prevent sound from escaping. But they would be basic seals, hastily placed, and the walls themselves weren't soundproof. Two flashed through a set of hand seals and then flattened her palms against the wall. Her chakra reached out through the grains of the wood and amplified any vibrations that touched it. The jutsu would transfer those vibrations to her inner ear where her brain could translate them into sound as easily as if they were coming from an earpiece. As the technique took hold, a loud roar filled her hearing, punctuated by shaking booms. Two winched and jerked back instinctively, then narrowed her eyes in concentration as she focused her chakra and adjusted the technique to focus on sounds coming from inside the room only. It required almost more control than she had to block out the wind buffeting the building and vibrations from other parts of the building, but after a minute the clamor quieted and voices filtered through instead. Two breathed a silent sigh of relief. The possibility of being deafened by this jutsu was a very real threat, and precisely why it was such a little-known technique. There were four voices talking over each other inside. After a minute two was able to sort them out into Kazuma and three other members of the daimyo's 12 guardians. "We might get support from Lord Suzuki," one of them said. The wall muffled his voice just enough that two couldn't quite place his identity. "No, I don't think so," someone else said. "He's sleeping with Lady Yoshida and she had him wrapped around her finger. He barely blinks without her say so and she'd shoot us down in a second. We don't need more financial backing anyway," a third voice argued. The first man scoffed. "Wandering nin don't come cheap. We shouldn't have to hire anyone. What we need is an ideological change, starting from the ground up. Anything else will just fall apart." "I agree," another man said, and this one too immediately recognized as Kazuma. He was being unusually reticent. Usual he couldn't wait to shove his opinion down someone's throat. The fourth Hokage would have perfect, but he wound up getting himself killed by the goddamn Nine Tails. And now we've spent the past decade waiting for the third Hokage to kick the bucket for finally step down. He's holding onto that post with a fucking death grip. And that's why we're backing Shimura Danzo, the second man said. During the last succession they picked a young shinobi. Why would they pick someone the same age as the third Hokage now? Then that's where we come in, Kazuma said. We need to exert more pressure on the daimyo's advisors to make certain they pick Danzo when the time comes. A round of murmured arguments rippled through the gathered shinobi. And when exactly would the time be? The first shinobi spat out. We've been waiting on the sidelines for over years. We can't assassinate a Kage. Can't or won't? Won't, obviously. We don't want to start a civil war. Civil war would be preferable to watching the country rot around us because a pacifist Hokage doesn't have the guts to do what needs to be done. That's enough. Kazuma's voice cut through the noise and the others fell silent. Narita is right. Civil war will only make things worse. We need to take this slowly, carefully. We need to wait for the right time, and then we'll place Danzo in the Hokage seat. Are we sure about him? I've heard he's just an old warhawk, the third man said uneasily. My contact says he's still extremely active in Leaf's Black Ops, the second man, Narita, replied. And more importantly, he holds the same ideals we do. He knows that Fire Country could burn through all our enemies if we actually took an active stance, rather than sitting with our hands under our asses like we have been. He would make a proper Hokage, with our backing. Another series of murmurs ran through the room. Enough rehashing of old arguments, said Kazuma. What about the situation with Lord Saito? Kakeru, have you made contact with his bodyguards yet? As the group degenerated into other discussions, Tu pulled her right hand away from the wall and cancelled her jutsu. She clung there for a minute longer, letting her ears adjust to the sudden quiet. A line of warmth trickled down her neck, and when she touched it the tip of her finger came away red. Tu grimaced. She'd probably damaged one of her eardrums. Once she was sure her ears had settled and she would be able to move without her balance getting thrown off, Tu darted back onto the roof and dashed across the buildings. She headed away from the main complex and toward the western wing of the palace, where several long buildings stood like off-shooting branches of a tree. Dropping back to the flagstone pavement, Tu silently moved to a door that had been placed far back into a dark alcove and slipped inside. Nama looked up from a scroll and put down his pen. He took in Tu's appearance with a single glance, then approached with one hand already glowing green from a medical jutsu. She tilted her head to the side to give him better access to her injured ear and diverted her eyes away as he worked. Tu chewed on her lip absently. Nama wouldn't ask any questions, it was what was great about him. And yet, I overheard Kazuma having a meeting with his groupies, Tu said just as Nama finished and stepped back. They want to replace the Hokage with someone of their own choosing. A coup? Patience was the word of the day, it seems, Tu said with a shake of her head. I suppose that's one characteristic of Kazuma's we can be glad for. She hesitated. I feel like this is something to be reported. Nama raised an eyebrow. To leave? Tu scoffed. Of course not, but this could affect Takagi-sama's relationship with the Hokage if it got out. She growled and roughly ran a hand through her short hair. It's just more of Kazuma's political maneuverings, I know. He won't actually do anything. Groaning, the kunoichi dropped onto the futon that lay against the wall. Nama returned to his small table, but didn't pick his pen up yet. He folded his hands on top of its wooden surface and watched Tu with piercing eyes. I guess I just don't like the idea of Kazuma plotting, Tu grumbled. It's not like he would ever do anything to go against Takagi-sama. He's practically a fanatic. Fanatics are the most unpredictable of loyalists, Nama said. Yay, true. Tu frowned and tapped her fingers against the wooden floor planks. I suppose I'll just keep an eye on him like usual. You mind helping? She grinned and batted her eyes, but Nama's expression remained as passive as ever. I will be out of the city for the next few weeks on an errand for Shijimi-sama, he said. But later I will be glad to be of help. Damn, well, thanks anyway. Tu let out an explosive breath, stretched, and then left with a backward wave. Nama picked up his pen and finished his scroll. Several minutes later, as he penned the finishing touches, a large brown shinobi cat slunk out of the shadows next to a cabinet. Nama rolled up the scroll and held it out. Tora, he greeted. The cat took the scroll with his paw and it disappeared in a small burst of smoke. She's getting nosy, Tora said. Kazuma's been careless. That oaf is always careless, Tora said with a snort. She sat back on her haunches and her tail curled around to rest on her front paws. But I'll pass the warning along. Keep an eye on Tu, would you? She's too headstrong and too useful to be lost just yet. She has served the daimyo faithfully for 15 years, Nama said quietly. Yes, and that's why I want you to watch her. Keep her out of trouble. Nama inclined his head respectfully. The cat nodded, satisfied, and then slunk back into the shadows. Nama waited for 3 long breaths, until he was sure Tora had left, before he let his hands uncurl from where they'd been fisted in his lap. 3 p.m., February 15, 3:12 TE. Hidden Leaf Village, Central District. Naruto had barely been back in Hidden Leaf Village for an hour when he heard a shout of, "Naruto-san," coming from behind him. A second later a green blur dashed past him, skidded to a stop, and then jogged back to him. Lee? Hello Naruto-san, the taller boy said with a wide grin. Abruptly, Naruto realized that Lee had grown even taller since he'd last seen him about a month ago, and now he only just came up to Lee's chin. Why the hell was everybody getting taller than him? I have been looking for you. As much as I love to hang around waiting for Hyuga to come by, I was out of the village on a mission, Naruto said. Lee's grin never faltered, if anything, it widened at Naruto's dig against his rival. I just thought you might want to know that the last joint mission we went on has been voided. The client was declared to be of an unsound mind. Huh, so that tiger actually drove someone insane? Naruto had to admit that that far outstripped the result of any of his pranks. Lee was still standing there watching him expectantly, waiting for a response. What did he want? Congratulations for telling him. Naruto sure as hell wasn't going to say, thank you. Although, his blood was still pumping from the run back to Hidden Leaf Village and Lee was a budding taijutsu master. "Do you want to spar?" Naruto asked. With eyes the size of saucers, Lee stared at him. Naruto thought he looked kind of like the mouse he occasionally found in his apartment that generally stared at him with much the same expression. Naruto had yet to figure out how it avoided all his traps, but considering the integrity, or lack thereof, of some of his walls, it wasn't too surprising. Without any warning, Lee lunged forward and hugged him tightly enough that for a second Naruto thought he was trying to tear him in half and a couple of his ribs really did crack. Lee lifted him completely off the ground and then a moment later dropped him while laughing boisterously. Naruto coughed and spluttered as the internal bleeding quickly stopped. When Lee tried to slap him on the shoulder, Naruto swiftly dodged before he could unintentionally cause any more damage. "We shall head to the fields and test our flames of youth," Lee shouted, pumping one fist in the air and no doubt imitating his sensei. He then latched onto Naruto's arm and dragged him down the street while loudly chattering on about something. What? Naruto wasn't sure because his ears were ringing from being jerked around so much. As they walked, however, Naruto did notice one glaring detail. The civilians were staring at Lee, not him. Obviously Naruto was well aware that Lee was weird and probably drew stares wherever he went, but generally when Naruto was walking down the street he could feel dozens of eyes on him, but not see anyone staring. He could feel the attention and see the subtle cold shoulders as people turned their backs or looked away, refusing to look him in the eye and acknowledge that he was there. But Lee? People didn't even notice that Naruto was there with him. They were all staring at him in open shock and fascination. It was like he was a human buffer between Naruto and them. A smile spread across Naruto's face. Lee was weird, alright. Really, really weird. But suddenly Naruto liked weird. Plus, he bet that some of the double takes and just bit into a lemon looks that people were giving Lee would never get old. Maybe sparring with him now and again wouldn't be so bad. 7:30 p.m., February 15, 3:12 TE. Hidden Leaf Village, Southern Quarter. As Naruto had expected, the tiger was still lying under the deck of the crazy civilian's house. He looked a fair deal worse than when Naruto'd last seen him, as though a suicidal painter had started fading out his stripes. Or at least they looked faded to him. It was a bit hard to tell in the darkness. "You should probably see a vet or something," was the first thing out of Naruto's mouth when he saw him. "Couldn't a vet help you, even though you're a summon?" The tiger didn't open his eyes, but from the way his tail twitched Naruto could tell he was awake. After a second the tiger lifted his head slightly, though he kept his eyes shut. "I didn't think you'd be coming back," he said in a voice that was more of a low growl in the back of his throat than anything else. "Why? Why what? Why did you return? You gained nothing from helping me." Naruto snorted. "Of course I gained something from helping you. I'm not a charity worker. But you're a tiger summon and getting on your good side could be in my favor." The tiger snorted as well. "Move," he said. "Wah. Move aside," he said again, this time more firmly. Naruto did so, and then watched in shock as the tiger started to crawl out from under the deck. He moved slowly and paused for a few seconds after each movement, but before long he was sitting before Naruto in the afternoon light. Naruto immediately realized that he was much, much larger than he'd looked in the darkness beneath the deck. Sitting on his haunches he was several feet taller than Naruto was, quite a bit larger than the size of a bear that the crazy client had described him to be. His fur also looked coarse and matted, and seemed to be stretched over his bones. Beneath it Naruto could count all of his ribs. Then the tiger opened his eyes and Naruto gasped. He was blind. Naruto hadn't been able to tell before, but now it was obvious. His eyes were clouded by a milky white, but he was still staring at Naruto, through him, as though he could see him. "I need chakra," the tiger said. "We summon animals live off chakra rather than food." So that meant Naruto had wasted all that money and time for nothing? "Why didn't you say that in the first place?" he snapped. "I was waiting to die." A jolt ran through Naruto. The idea was completely foreign to him. Why would he want life to end? Why wouldn't he do everything in his power to stop death? Why? Naruto asked aloud, morbidly curious. The tiger sighed heavily and lowered his head. "I come from Mount Toriyama, home of the Tiger Clan. Born defected, I was considered useless and cast aside. No doubt I would have died young, like all others born with deformities. But," he bared his teeth in what looked like a wicked grin, "I was never one to take my fate lying down. I left Toriyama to explore the world on my own, and hopefully find the strength to succeed. And you failed? Naruto guessed. The tiger certainly didn't seem young to him, but he was hardly an expert at guessing anyone's age, let alone a fucking tiger. The tiger laughed loudly. Hardly. Through my travels I learned more about the manipulation of chakra and its applications. What I found, ultimately, was a way to see using the energy of the world around me, he said. He grinned again. I can see better than you can, boy. Then why? He seemed to slump in on himself at Naruto's words. My independence was a double-edged sword, he said. While I learned more than my brethren could have dreamed, what I had not known was just how dependent we are on chakra. Because we summons have our homes built over places on the earth that are naturally rich in chakra, we do not realize that we are feeding on that chakra every day. Even the contracts we make with humans exist for the sole reason of helping us to survive. When we are summoned by a human, they sacrifice a portion of their chakra to us in exchange. It is in part because of this that those summoned grow stronger and stronger, and that the most powerful amongst us require the most chakra. During my countless years of wandering, I had not been near any sort of chakra source. By the time I realized I had been slowly starving to death, I was already too far away to return. This village, Hidden Leaf Village, was the closest collection of ambient chakra that I could find, so I came here to stave off what I knew was coming. It was not long before I realized that it was inevitable. Naruto stayed silent after the tiger finished his story. Honestly, he felt more than a little awkward. He wasn't good with sympathy sort of stuff or social emotions in general. He generally tried to push them away and ignore them whenever possible, but a massive 1,000-pound tiger sitting 2 feet away from him was not something he could ignore. You just need to have chakra sacrificed to you, right? Naruto said suddenly. Couldn't I do that, even without a contract thingy? The tiger sat silently. It didn't take a genius to guess that he was an extremely prideful creature, and that he would rather starve than accept some sort of a handout. It wasn't a concept that Naruto could empathize with, but he could at least understand it. How about we come to an agreement then? I give you chakra and you help me out when I ask. A fair trade, Naruto offered. And how is that different from a summoning contract? The tiger laughed. Well, no summoning for one, unless you'd like to strap a smoke bomb on your back so that it looks like you're being summoned, Naruto shot back. But hey, if a fair trade doesn't sound good to you, you could always just take the chakra and head back to Mount Tiger or whatever. The tiger snarled at him and Naruto nearly jumped back, heart-pounding. The tiger's teeth were nearly the length of one of his hands. I will do no such thing, he growled. I have honor, more honor than my brethren by far. If it's a contract you want, then it's a contract you'll get. As the anger drained from the tiger, it seemed to take all of his energy with it. Looking frailer than ever in the sunlight, he sunk down until he was lying on his stomach and looked up at Naruto. How does this work then? It looks like you really need the chakra, Naruto said. For a moment the tiger didn't respond. He'd closed his eyes again and it almost looked like he was sleeping. Without opening them he said, place your hand on my head. Will your chakra to me and it will be so. Naruto was dubious about anything that was supposed to magically happen. He could still recall the one street magician he'd seen as a kid and how the man had screamed and fled when Naruto stuck his hand through the bottom of the cage he'd been using and took out the bird hidden there. It had been a pathetically obvious illusion. Despite his doubts, however, Naruto did as the tiger asked and placed his hand lightly on his head. His fur was warmer than Naruto expected, practically radiating heat. Naruto focused his attention on his hand and began to channel his chakra, wanting it like the tiger said, and gasped faintly when he felt a tugging sensation on his chakra, as though a hand was softly grasping it and pulling it down. The energy flowed around the tiger and seemed to settle on top of him for a moment before sinking into his fur. The tiger released a deep, satisfied sigh. It has been too long, he said wistfully. He opened his blind eyes again. You may call me Tokui, little shinobi. Uzumaki Naruto. Does this mean you don't want to die anymore? Naruto asked cheekily. Tokui swatted a large paw at Naruto, not really intending to hit him. Don't think you can be fresh with me, boy. It will take me time to gain my strength back, but that does not mean you can disrespect me. A contract is a mutual agreement. It requires the willing trust and acceptance of both parties. Now lead me to your den. I will rest there so that I can snack on your chakra whenever I wish. You're lucky I have a hell of a lot of chakra then. Naruto chuckled. He paused for a moment, considering something. Why haven't you tried to form a contract with a human before? I'm sure someone would have agreed to it. Tokui gave Naruto a look that he couldn't quite decipher. I did, he answered. Once. He stood up and circled around Naruto. Even on 4 legs he was as tall as Naruto was and could knock him over just by brushing up against him. His head stopped next to Naruto's and the boy gulped, realizing that he could literally bite his head off and swallow it whole if he wanted to. Naruto wasn't sure if even he could heal from something like that. I'm pretty sure someone is going to notice if I bring a giant tiger into my apartment, Naruto pointed out when he didn't seem inclined to elaborate further. Tokui bared his teeth in another grin and laughed. It was unnerving for Naruto to hear so close to his face, since the tiger's laugh sounded half like growls. You forget that I am a summon, not just a dumb beast, he said. If I want to hide, you humans will never notice me. Lead, and I shall follow. He began to walk forward, away from Naruto, and as he did so he seemed to fade into the world around him. A second later Naruto blinked and he was completely gone. I have got to learn that trick, Naruto breathed. No matter how hard his eyes strained, he couldn't see even a flicker of movement. Is that how you hid from Hyuga's Byakugan? By turning invisible? I know nothing of this, Byakugan, but I am not invisible. Tokui's voice came from somewhere ahead. I am merely altering your perception. This technique forces your mind to look elsewhere, to avoid seeing me. The only reason you found me in the first place was because I was too tired to keep the technique up for long. Now, are you coming? Naruto quickly dusted off his pants and hurried ahead. Slipping onto the street was easy enough and no one started screaming about a giant man-eating tiger. Though Naruto half wished they would because that would be awesome, so he figured they were safe. If Tokui was still following him, he could be lost, for all Naruto knew. It took less than half an hour to reach his dingy little apartment on the 5th floor of a large complex. He held the front door to the complex open wide, and nearly jumped out of his skin when he felt something brush past him. Well, I guess you're not lost in Never Never Land then, Naruto muttered and got another quiet chuckle in response. They headed up the stairs, by some miracle coming across no other humans along the way. When they finally reached Naruto's apartment, the shinobi deactivated the traps around his door and dodged out of the way of 3 shuriken that then embedded themselves in the wall behind him. Aren't you concerned that those will hurt someone? Asked Tokui. Nah, that's the whole point of setting traps. Besides, this building is reserved for shinobi and shinobi in training, so anyone who activates my traps deserves what they get. At last Naruto opened his door. It seemed to push itself further open as Tokui slipped inside. Naruto was just locking the door behind him when he heard the quiet poof of a dispelling jutsu. As he turned he saw that Tokui was fading back into view next to his couch. One of his paws was pressed firmly against the floor, half under the couch, and there was smoke dissipating from beneath his paw. You had a little mouse visitor, Tokui growled. Naruto frowned at the apparent lack of blood. Oh, you finally caught that thing? The tiger's eyes cut sharply up to Naruto's. You have seen it hanging about? Yeah? He withdrew his paw and there was nothing underneath it. It was a mouse summon, Tokui explained. It seems someone has been spying on you. 6 a.m., February 20th 3:12 TE. Sasuke's apartment. Fact. Uchiha Sasuke could not stand messes. He liked things to be neat and organized. He liked things to be well within his control. He did not like surprises or changes or even having something disturb him while he was concentrating. Sasuke wanted his life to fit into a neat little box, and he hated it when it was not, so he went out of his way to categorize everything that he could. Fact. Uchiha Itachi massacred the Uchiha clan. Solution. Uchiha Sasuke would kill Uchiha Itachi. Fact. Uchiha Sasuke was the last of the Uchiha clan. Solution. Uchiha Sasuke would repopulate the Uchiha clan. He was not sure on the specifics of the last one yet. He figured he would get there once Itachi was gone. As he thought, Sasuke scrubbed his breakfast dishes. Washing away the soap, he held the plate up to the light, frowned, then scrubbed some more. At last he placed the dish in the rack. He frowned and rotated it slightly to the left. He hung the towel on the rack over the oven and then smoothed it out. He picked up the towel, shook it out, and hung it back up. He then picked it up again and repeated the process. Sasuke checked his clothes one last time before heading to the door at 6:25. He patted down his pockets, mentally taking stock of his equipment. 20 shuriken and 2 coils of wire in his leg pouch. 5 kunai in his left pocket, 6 kunai in his the right. He took out one of them and set it down on his desk. 5 kunai in his left pocket, 5 kunai in his right. Sasuke looked back down at the table, made sure the tip of the kunai was facing down precisely, and frowned. Fact: there was dust on the table. Solution: get out the dust cloth and clean it. At 6:33, when he was finally satisfied, Sasuke left and locked the door behind him. As he left the apartment and headed toward the academy, he stared stoically ahead, ignoring the stares he garnered as he walked. He had found over the years that anyone who recognized him displayed one of two reactions. Either a look saying, "Oh, that poor boy," or a look of wary suspicion, like he was a caged, bloodthirsty beast that would turn on them at any moment. Sasuke's hands tightened into fists. Fact: Uchiha Sasuke was not the same person as his brother. Solution: Uchiha Sasuke would kill Uchiha Itachi. Sasuke arrived at the academy at exactly 7:04, as he did every day. He made his way into the classroom and sat down at 7:07, and by 7:10 was sitting with his notebook placed before him exactly in the center of the desk. He straightened the pencil next to it so that it was 2 centimeters away and perfectly parallel. At approximately 7:26 the fangirls came running into the room, screaming at the top of their lungs and jarring Sasuke away from where he had been staring at the blackboard, counting the pieces of chalk and resisting the urge to walk up to it and clean it with a wet towel. He could see the chalk residue from yesterday's lesson and it bothered him, but he had long since learned to express restraint when it came to other people's messes, and doing so truly did take a lot of self-control. If there was one thing Sasuke prided himself on, it was control. Fact: the fangirls were loud, obnoxious, and completely useless. Solution: ignore their existence. Sasuke stared staunchly ahead. He did his best to pretend that there were not banshees clamoring around him, screeching in his ears and probably doing their best to burst his eardrums. He clenched his teeth and scowled at the wall. He could not wait until he was out of there. Away from the stupid little girls. Away from the teachers who either sneered behind his back and taught him as little as they could, or praised him for anything he did and silently bumped up his grade. Away from the annoying, repetitive lessons that he had mastered months ago. Once he was an actual shinobi, Sasuke would be well on his way to taking revenge for his clan. One of the girls next to him tried to talk to him. Sasuke ignored her. He had no desire to talk to his classmates. The only one who had actually tried hard to become a shinobi was that blonde boy, Uzukami, he thought it was. And even he had dropped out, probably because he could not use any jutsu. None of these people were worth his time. They would just hold him back. He did not like conversations anyway. People and their emotions were an unknown variable, something he had no control over. He would not have the first clue about how to respond. He could not even remember the last time he had held a real conversation with someone. It was probably before his clan died. He point-blank refused to talk to the therapist they kept trying to send him to. Telling someone how he felt was nothing but a weakness that could be used against him. That therapist could easily tell others his thoughts, or sell the information to an enemy. Fact: Uchiha Sasuke trusted no one. Solution: Uchiha Sasuke talked to no one. And if he was lonely, well, that did not matter. His life was dedicated to those who had died, his family. He did not care what others thought of him, or if they thought he was a security risk. He had his goals, and he would do anything to accomplish them. If that meant training on his own until his hands bled and he puked from overexertion, so be it. Fact: Uchiha Sasuke would kill Uchiha Itachi. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.